Every now and then, an invention comes along that shocks the world and changes the way things are done forever. Back in the 1800s, it was the steam engine that brought about the Industrial Revolution. In our day, the closest thing we might have to this is AI. Don't worry, I'm not an AI Mike Brady. Yet. But in 1906, something happened that impacted naval warfare forever, when a new class of ship was designed that was so radical, so revolutionary, every other battleship was rendered obsolete almost overnight. Her name was HMS Dreadnought, a name which means fear nothing. The Royal Navy has always been pretty good at choosing awesome names. Dreadnought brought about changes to the design of battleships that influenced naval architects for years to come. It's a bit ironic, though, that the ship was so revolutionary when the battleship itself would, within a few decades, be rendered almost useless by the aircraft carrier. But still, when she first hit the waves in 1906, Dreadnought was the undisputed queen. What was it about this mighty ship that inspired so much change? And how did her design result in one of the fiercest arms races in history? Her career would prove as wildly unpredictable as her design was revolutionary, including a hilarious prank, a dramatic collision, and much more. This is the fascinating true story of the development of the battleship Dreadnought, the warship that changed everything. In February 1906, a new hull thundered down the slipway at Portsmouth. She looked similar to many other battleships launched before her, with a vast grey hull, beautifully streamlined to eke out the most speed from her steam engines. But that was almost where the similarities ended, because the onlookers watching the ship's launch would mostly have been ignorant to her secret design genius. This was the hull of Britain's newest battleship, the Dreadnought, and the launch would send shockwaves around Europe. To really understand why Dreadnought was such a big deal, we have to turn the calendar back a few years to the 1700s and 1800s. See, warships for the longest time had followed a fairly simple formula. Ships of the line were massive floating bastions of pine and oak, mounting as many cannons their decks could fit without giving way. Ships in the 1700s and 1800s under Lord Nelson largely resembled their forebears from the 1500s and 1600s under Drake. No, not that Drake. Yeah, that's the one, thank you. They relied on sails and the wind, so they were at the mercy of the sea, and they were limited to slow speeds. Their cannon had ranges out to just a couple of 100 yards and fired either solid shot, cannonballs, or special shot designed to take down the enemy's masts and rigging and leave them helpless. Now, these limitations meant that for hundreds of years, ships of the line would close to almost point-blank ranges and engage in roaring gun duels, firing into one another's hull and sending boarding parties to kill and capture. It was really gnarly stuff. In fact, if you've seen the movie Master and Commander, one of my absolute favourites of all time, you'll get some sense of what I mean here. But that's just the way it was for a very, very long time. Advancements in ship design were few and sluggish. The admiralties of France, Britain, Denmark, Holland, all the big ones, they were usually slow to react to change. Things had worked just fine for centuries. Why mess with the formula? Well, in the early 1800s, they were forced to pay attention because suddenly ships were chugging around powered not just by the wind, but by steam engines. The advantages were obvious. Now, warships weren't totally at the mercy of the wind and the waves. Where frigates and big three-decker gunships alike might once have been stuck for weeks on end in a calm without any wind, suddenly steam-powered sloops and other vessels could forge ahead with no worries. Soon enough, the steam engine meant advancements in iron, and eventually steel construction could also be made. Within those few heady decades, warships had gone from looking like this to this. Okay, well, the outside might look vaguely similar, but the propulsion inside was hugely, hugely different. What wasn't very different were the guns. See, for a while there, steam warships were essentially just Napoleonic frigates kitted with steam engines. They still relied on those old cannons to hurl iron balls into the enemy at close range, but that was soon to change. In the mid-1800s, some advancements were made in gun design that would change everything. Suddenly, some bright sparks came up with the idea of rifling gun barrels. It meant that shells could grip the grooves inside as they were fired and spin through the air with significant advantages to both range and accuracy. Suddenly, cannonballs were a thing of the past. And crucially, these new guns were loaded not at the mouth of the barrel, but at the back in the breech of the gun. Now, this could also speed up the reloading process and improve standards of safety. Soon enough, some other bright sparks floated the idea of putting these new breech loaders into turrets that could swing around, and the turret warship was born. Now, these new ships could fire in almost 360 degrees, and they didn't need to creep up on their enemy to point their ship in the direction the guns needed to fire. Now, the turret ship, as it was called, had a bit of a troubled history, especially in the British Royal Navy, where some teething issues resulted in some rather unhappy designs getting approved from construction. Now, we did a video on HMS Captain, you should check it out. But eventually, the formula had been refined, and by the late Victorian era, warships were heavy, fat, squat things powered by reciprocating steam engines with turrets that could fire in all directions. They weren't very seaworthy, to be sure, but sails were now a thing of the past too, and the modern battleship was born. It had been a remarkably short path to get warships looking like this, to this, within less than 100 years, but at last, iron-hulled, steam-powered, turreted battleships ruled the waves. Try saying that 5 times quickly. The only issue was that in that latter part of the 1800s, they saw very little actual combat, so navies and admirals had these fancy new toys with only vague ideas of what they were actually capable of. They got some idea during the American Civil War, when the ironclads USS Monitor and CSS Virginia went toe-to-toe in a lengthy, fruitless engagement with neither able to really penetrate the iron-armoured hull of the other. The takeaway was that guns needed to be able to outperform the armour they were firing at, so the race between armour and gunpowder erupted, and at first armour won as shells bounced uselessly off of hull plating, but slowly the naval gun became larger and more powerful, and scarier. By the late 1800s, battleships could fire shells out to a distance of 6,000 yards, that's over 5 kilometres away, and they were, for a time, the undisputed kings of the ocean. That is, until a little invention came along called the torpedo. Now, don't worry, we are making our way to the Dreadnought, but now we need to talk about this fancy new invention because it shook everything up. Battleships were at this point big, fat, slow, floating castles festooned with guns of all kinds of calibers, adept at smashing through armour plating. Did I mention they were slow? Yeah, they were pretty slow. Usually featuring pairs of expansion steam engines, late 19th century battleships might have been capable of maximum speeds up to 16 knots, which was pretty impressive for the day. But the introduction of a new kind of warship made them sitting ducks. The torpedo boat burst rudely onto the scene in the late 1800s, a small, fast, steam-powered vessel capable of cracking top speeds but little bigger than a small private yacht. Now this, you may think, might have made them sitting ducks themselves. Of course, a single hit from a battleship gun could easily send them to the bottom. But they fielded a fearsome new weapon. That new invention we mentioned earlier, the torpedo. The torpedo boat was a sensation when first introduced, and the world's navies stocked up rapidly because, in theory, swarms of fast, cheap torpedo boats could encircle lumbering, expensive battleships and escorting cruisers, send fields of torpedoes roaring towards them, and cause all kinds of havoc with the sluggish battleships unable to turn in time to avoid them. Now, this is the kind of tit-for-tat arms race that was kept up through the 19th century and into the early 1900s, as all kinds of new technologies were dreamt up, tested and implemented for the first time. Of course, we all take this for granted now. The concept of a torpedo or a battleship is all pretty common knowledge, but try to put this into context by remembering that the grandfathers of captains aboard late Victorian battleships would have been at sea aboard the likes of HMS Victory. This was also new, so daring. A few visionaries in the British Admiralty knew it, and they were driving for change. So it was, by the early 1900s, that the Royal Navy was presented with the following problems. First of all, battleships had begun to mount large secondary guns. They were smaller caliber weapons than the main armament, but during shelling though, the rapid fire of the smaller secondaries could often obscure the target with the amount of shell splashes. This of course in an era where adjustments to fire were entirely visual. Not only that, but the advent of torpedoes meant that battleships would need to engage from further away to reduce the risk of attack. Now this range increase would render the secondaries useless anyway, it was thought. Not only that, but the battleships would need to be fast, sleek, and speedy enough to get into position, hit the enemy battleships and cruisers hard, and get out before a mass torpedo assault could be mounted in response. The basic shape of the battleship would need to change, and so too the kinds of guns it should carry. In the early 1900s, some visionaries, including the Italian naval architect Vittorio Cuniberti, began to advocate for an all-big-gun battleship, a return to the days of old when a battleship's main duty was just to lob heavy shells. In theory, a battleship would be escorted by cruisers and other smaller warships anyway, so they could act as the secondary guns. He presented his ideas first to the Italian Navy, who rejected him, and then to the public in a popular journal. His proposal called for a large ship, sleek and lean, displacing about 17,000 tons, capable of 24 knots and fielding no fewer than 12 huge 12-inch guns paired in turrets. Now, this concept was, for the time, basically pulling numbers out of Cuniberti's hat because getting a battleship up to that speed must have seemed an impossibility. Still, Royal Navy battleships had begun to get slimmer and sleeker, and therefore faster. Although they were still powered by triple expansion steam engines, HMS King Edward VII and her sister ships, built in 1902 and introduced in 1905, could scream along at 18.5 knots, which was a great improvement, and they were much more hydrodynamic than the stubby old warships of the late 19th century. Actually, here's an interesting side point. Remember when I talked about the battle between guns and armour? Well, for a while there, it was thought that ramming an enemy's ship could do more damage quicker than simply shelling them, so many warships were built with reinforced ram bows. The HMS King Edward VII and her sisters were some of them, but the ram bow had an unexpected side effect. It cancelled out the ship's bow wave to some extent, reducing drag through the water. It made the ships faster and more efficient. Now today, we use this kind of bow on most, if not all, big passenger cruise ships. They're called bulbous bows. Anyway, King Edward VII was quick and sleek, but she only mounted 4 main 12-inch guns and a spread of secondaries up to 9 inches. Now, this of course meant that in a pinch, with her bow pointed at the enemy, she could only get 2 guns on target at maximum combat range. The British sought to rectify these issues with a new kind of battleship, but they weren't alone. It has to be said that so too did the Japanese and the United States. All three were major naval powers at the time, and they recognised the same opportunity. The designers got to work, and history was about to be made. The idea of the old big gun battleship had a powerful proponent in Britain. First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher had called for such a design around the turn of the century. He had read keenly about the Japanese fleet in action against the Russians in 1905 and taken some key lessons away. First, he knew that 12-inch main battery gunfire was hugely important in dealing massive amounts of damage to the enemy. But he also became obsessed with speed. Outmaneuvering the enemy would be a massive advantage to any battleship fleet. Now, this new breed of battleship needed to be quick. Unfortunately, the British had just the kind of mechanical ace up their sleeve that would give them the speed they needed. In the late 1800s, engineer Charles Algernon Parsons, Algernon is such an awesome middle name by the way, began to perfect a new kind of engine. Conventional reciprocating steam engines at the time used huge cylinders to expand steam under pressure and shift their pistons up and down. This movement, like the engine in your car, would then drive a crankshaft attached to propellers down long shafts. It was a mechanically reliable concept, but there was a cap on how fast it could really drive a ship. It was clunky, used a lot of heavy machinery, and took up a ton of space inside the hull. Parsons designed a new kind of engine, however, the steam turbine. He figured you could simply place a large cylindrical rotor covered in fan blades inside of a casing and then blast steam under very high pressure through it. The blades would spin the rotor very quickly. Extremely quickly, in fact. His early tests got his turbine spinning at up to 18,000 revolutions per minute. His idea took some time to take off, but he demonstrated the concept dramatically in 1897 when he showed up unannounced aboard his test boat, the Turbinia, at Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee Naval Review. Now, like a speedboat, Turbinia roared up and down the lines of old battleships, and the stunt encouraged Admiralty attendance at formal speed trials. Eventually, the turbine was accepted for use on some smaller warships where it proved a powerful engine capable of achieving, when paired with a sleek hull form, impressive speeds. Now, it had never yet been used on a warship exceeding 340 tons. In 1904, the turbine was installed aboard an Oceanliner, Allen Line's Virginian, for the first time. Eventually, it would go on to power the world's fastest ships, from Mauritania and Lusitania up to the Queen Mary and the United States. But remember, for the sake of our little story here, that the year now is just 1904, and this newfangled turbine is still a contraption yet to be fully proved. Fisher and the Admiralty took a bit of a leap when they decided to equip their new battleship type with the Parsons turbine. In fact, so new was the technology that Vickers, the primary contractor for machinery and naval contracts, deferred instead to Parsons directly. The 4 turbines were paired and drove 4 propellers, outputting some 27,000 shaft horsepower. It was hoped that the new battleship would be able to hit speeds of up to 21 or 22 knots, because the powerful new turbine engines were also lighter than the older style triple expansion steam engines. In the end, the decision to use them resulted in a power plant that was 1,100 tons lighter. The sleek hull was tested with large models in the Admiralty test tanks, and the result was a thin, fine hull form. Now, it's a good thing the turbine machinery installation proved to be smaller too, because the new battleship would need all the extra space she could get, because the plan for her guns was just as radical. Now, conventionally, battleships from the time with turrets had mounted a pair of guns forward and a pair aft. Then astride the ship's centerline, sets of secondaries were arranged along the hull. Now, this was an effective use of space, but it meant that if the T of the battleship was crossed, that is to say, if the enemy managed to cut across the battleship's bow and pour a full broadside into her, the responding battleship could only answer with 2 of her main guns pointing forward. Fisher and the Admiralty decided to finally implement the old big gun battleship concept that Cunibert had been talking about to counter this uncomfortable position. First, the secondaries, the larger secondaries, were deleted. The new battleship would be longer than the preceding King Edward VII class. The longer hull form would cut cleanly and more hydrodynamically through the water, but she would also be wider. Now, this was for good reason. Now, on the battleship's beam were mounted another pair of main gun turrets, both with twin 12 inches. The forecastle deck, the higher forward end of the ship, was slimmed so that it didn't reach the extreme edge of the ship's sides. Instead, the 2 new gun turrets could aim right down the centerline and fire forward to back up the first gun turrets, or swivel right around to fire aft. It meant that if the new battleship crossed the enemy's T, she could pour heavy shell fire from no fewer than 8 12-inch guns, double that of the previous generation of battleship. Now, this is where the genius of the new battleship truly lay. She could pour fire onto the enemy. If her T was crossed, she could get 3 gun turrets on target. A fleet of this new brand of warship would be devastating. Once they'd outmaneuvered the enemy, the volume of fire at range would be devastating. Work began in October 1905, and such was the importance of the project that she was ready for launch just 4 months later, and then completed within a year of her launch. Now, this was achieved at great expense to the comfort of the work crews, who were, first of all, doubled in their strength, and then had to work double shifts themselves, with only 30 minutes for lunch. On the ship's nameplate was the fearsome moniker Dreadnought. In fact, she was about the 10th Dreadnought of the Royal Navy, but her name would soon come to carry greater significance. Upon completion, the all-important speed trials began, and this would prove whether the whole thing had been worth it. With turbines whining incessantly, the ship roared ahead at nearly 22 knots, almost as quick as the fastest ocean liners of the day. Now, this was a great achievement, and Parsons' turbines absolutely proved their worth. Dreadnought was quick, and she was mean. Her guns were guided by another technological ace, her electric fire control. In the past, getting guns on target meant the use of optical rangefinders to manually calculate correct trajectories and range to target, which would then be yelled into a megaphone or a telephone to the gun crews. Dreadnought introduced an electrical system which could transmit the orders directly to the turrets over the din of the gunfire. Observational data was put into a kind of mechanical computer that relayed that data into a translated firing solution direct to the men at the guns. It was a brilliant bit of technology that meant Dreadnought could put up to 8 of those big 12-inch guns onto target with alarming accuracy for the time. Dreadnought brought a few other changes as well. Steel thicknesses in the hull plating and her armour were standardised and reduced to as few variations as possible. It helped to speed up her construction. In fact, the very speed with which Dreadnought came together was supposed to show off Britain's engineering might, never mind the poor workers who had sweated and toiled for months with very few breaks. So, HMS Dreadnought had burst unexpectedly onto the scene, and her abilities were being wildly proclaimed by engineering journals and the likes of popular books like Jane's Fighting Ships, who proudly boasted Dreadnought's capabilities were the equivalent of 2 or 3 older, conventional battleships. In fact, Dreadnought's speed and abilities were so good that Admiral Fisher's former naval assistant reported that no member of the Committee on Designs dared to hope that all the innovations introduced would have turned out as successfully as had been the case. Now, this was largely true, but of course it represented a good bit of British bluster. The ship was not perfect, and she certainly had her deficiencies. For one thing, she sat so low under heavy loading that her main thick armoured belt slipped beneath the waterline, meaning her thinner upper belt would be the vanguard against dangerous shell hits. But worst of all, she was extremely uncomfortable for her crew, especially her officers. A lieutenant recalled that the mess decks were small and cramped, that it was clear crew accommodation was more of an afterthought by the designers. Her officers had to walk from their quarters at the bow of the ship the full length just to go to the toilets or heads at the stern of the ship. Now, despite these teething troubles, Dreadnought's appearance came at just the right moment for the Royal Navy, as it did for the State Secretary of the German Imperial Navy, Alfred von Tirpitz. He had been assisted by the Kaiser in passing bills to build more German warships, but it hadn't been easy. In 1895, for example, the Reichstag approved funding for only 4 of the 36 cruisers proposed for construction. In 1905 and 6, though, things were different. German nationalism was being driven to fever pitch. The Dreadnought challenge had to be answered. Tirpitz's proposed 35% increase on naval spending was approved, and then, in 1908, another bill that guaranteed 3 or 4 battleships would be built per year. Now, critically, they wouldn't just be any old kind of battleship. They would, of course, be dreadnoughts. Fast, heavily armed battleships designed to bring as many guns to bear on target as the British warship could. From that point on, any battleship built prior to 1906 was known almost derisively as a pre-dreadnought. So revolutionary was the combination of dreadnought's components that she became a very class of ship unto herself. The kind of tit-for-tat arms race that followed as Britain and Germany pumped billions into their navies led almost directly to the tensions that caused the outbreak of the First World War. In fact, so fast was the rate of development that pretty soon Dreadnought herself was eclipsed by newer styles of battleship that built upon her once impressive platform. Now, you may ask yourself, surely a ship as decisive, as revolutionary as the Dreadnought would go on to have a spectacular and extremely eventful career? Well, no, the answer is not really. True, in the First World War, she did ram and cut a German submarine in half. But the Oceanliner Olympic did that, and she was hardly a fearsome war machine. No, the thing Dreadnought is most famous for is a practical joke. In 1910, some visiting delegates from Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, were invited to tour Dreadnought. They were greeted by an honour guard and officers in full dress uniform, shown around the fleet, and of course the flagship Dreadnought herself. Now, the only issue was that the Abyssinian delegates were actually English university students in bad makeup and costume, pulling a prank. They spoke in gibberish, and if they're shown something exciting, they loudly exclaimed, "Bunga bunga." Now, years later, in the First World War, when Dreadnought did ram and sink the submarine U-29, one of the congratulatory telegrams supposedly read, "Bunga." Now, aside from that action though, Dreadnought proved to be that one friend you can't seem to get along to a social catch-up. When the Battle of Jutland, possibly the most epic naval engagement of modern history, happened in 1916, Dreadnought was in for a scheduled overhaul. In a final kind of ignominious slight, Dreadnought saw out the rest of the war, providing coastal defense alongside a fleet of, you guessed it, pre-Dreadnought battleships that she had once helped eclipse. So it was that the most revolutionary battleship design of the early 20th century was reduced to little more than a reserve ship. In fact, that kind of mimics the story of the battleship as a whole. They proved instrumental in the First World War, but the Second World War, less than 20 years later, would essentially render them useless, and some of the greatest battleships in history were attacked and sunk by swarms of aircraft. HMS Repulse, the Prince of Wales, Bismarck, Yamato, and Musashi, they were all turned to rusting scrap metal on the seafloor by airplanes. Still, despite the realities of her service career, Dreadnought did her job well. She was a testbed for technologies that by themselves were not entirely revolutionary, but when combined into one, totally changed the game. She may not have seen heavy combat, but she still engaged her enemy, and she did earn a victory. Her very existence set off a chain of events that resulted in massive military spending and one of the mightiest clashes in military history. So, to HMS Dreadnought, we can say a final job well done, and bunga bunga, indeed. This is probably the most successful ship in history. Queen Mary. Her name today is synonymous with triumph, luxury, and glamour from days gone by. Fortunately, she's still with us, serving as a floating hotel. But for decades, she battled the worst of the Atlantic's tantrums and carried stars, migrants, troops, and officials to safety at unprecedented speed and comfort. She's, frankly, my favourite ocean liner, a giant that spawned a series of successes that culminated in the only ocean liner in service today, her namesake, Queen Mary 2. Over the years, we've told the Queen Mary's story piecemeal, but today, with enhanced graphics, we're excited to revisit the ship's epic life, her uncertain origins and near cancellation, and her epic clash with another grand ship which resulted in a legendary running rivalry. And this is the story of how they designed and built the Queen Mary. In 1926, the directors of the Cunard steamship line met to discuss plans for the direction of their world-renowned company. Cunard found itself in charge of a somewhat ragtag fleet of liners, the line itself having suffered casualties in the First World War. The regular transatlantic schedule was predominantly maintained by three giant, aging liners, Mauretania, Aquitania, and Berengaria. All three of these ships had a unique personality and attracted different clientele. The Mauretania drew a younger, chicer crowd. A Cunard promotional pamphlet stated that her passengers looked more like Vanity Fair fashion illustrations, and in the wake of Prohibition, she was renowned for her famous booze cruises off-season. Aquitania attracted a more austere passenger, the old money, a country family sort of atmosphere, formal and more attuned to the social hierarchy of the day. Berengaria, by contrast, attracted the flashy and the ostentatious. It was said that a Berengaria sailing is tempestuous with the exploding of flashlights, the pursuit of reporters. Everything about the Berengaria is on the grand, the opulent scale. Brilliant Cunard promotional copywriting aside, the fact became clear that by the late 1920s, Cunard's great trio was aging, and endangering the line of becoming completely outclassed. Mauretania, by that point, was 20 years old, and probably due for retirement. By contrast, the German line Norddeutsche Lloyd were constructing a whole new generation of liner, the radical SS Bremen and Europa, while the Italian line was planning the Conte di Savoia and Rex. It was clear that now, more than ever, size and speed in passenger ships at sea were of the utmost importance, and Cunard could not be left behind if the company was to remain a major player on the Atlantic. The strategy that Cunard would take was set. It would call for a pair of sister ships, the largest and fastest ever seen. And they would not just be so for posterity. Sir Percy Bates, the company's chairman, explained that the speed is dictated by the time necessary to complete the journey at all seasons of the year and in both directions. The size is dictated by the necessity to make money by providing sufficient saleable passenger accommodation to pay for the speed. In the opinion of its technical advisors, so far from attempting to construct steamers simply to compete with others in speed and size, the Cunard company is projecting a pair of steamers which, though they will be very large and fast, are in fact the smallest and slowest, which can fulfill properly all the essential economic conditions. Essentially, Sir Percy was proposing that the future largest and fastest ships in the world would also be the smallest and slowest practicable. The introduction of the two monstrous and speedy liners would facilitate a planned reduction in the company's fleet size, a simple cost-cutting move in response to the existing and aging fleet, but also the reduction in immigrant numbers to the United States. By 1931, the Cunard Big Three were attracting only 48,000 people, compared to the passengers carried by Bremen and Europa, 82,000 in 1928 and 88,000 in 1930. The Cunard Big Three might finally be retired, out with the old and in with the new. The pair of new superliners were so closely tied to Cunard's proposed regular timetable that in the earliest days of planning, a schedule was worked out tracking the average speeds required on west and eastbound crossings. It was proved that the pair would need to be blue ribbon winning ships maintaining an average speed between 27 and 29 knots. The schedule would require 2,000 paying customers to maintain the cost of such speeds while still turning a decent profit. This would require an immense bulk, some 80,000 gross tons and over 1,000 feet in length. If Cunard didn't have the reputation for being the foremost British shipping line, the plan would sound ludicrous. But fortunately, a long-standing relationship with the Scottish John Brown Shipbuilding Company on the Clyde could see the dream become a reality. John Brown had built many of Cunard's ships, including Lusitania and Aquitania, and were no strangers to vessels of great size, having relatively recently constructed massive warships like the battle cruisers Hood and Repulse. They were the natural choice for the job. The stock market crash of 1929 brought immense difficulties to Cunard's great plan for the pair of sisters. Not only was the natural reduction in national and societal wealth having an impact on passenger numbers, but no British insurer could be found to cover the vast expenses required. This prevented a contract from even being signed between John Brown and Cunard until the issue could be solved. By 1930, the proposed superliners had become public knowledge, and Cunard approached the British government to ask for assistance in insuring the ships. The Times newspaper took a fairly dim view on this in September 1930 when it asked, "Is it wise that Parliament should be asked to lend a hand to a project planned on so colossal a scale that private enterprise could not find the means to carry it through? The real question is whether so large and so elaborate a masterpiece is really needed to convey passengers across the Atlantic. The possibilities of the vessels being an economic failure have to be faced." Despite this sentiment, the request was actually met with approval, and in December that year, the Cunard Insurance Act was passed by Parliament. This meant that a private insurer could cover up to the usual amount of, say, £2.7 million required for construction, while the British government would assume the balance of the risk for the roughly £1.5 million that was remaining. Sir Percy Bates was a master political player and was able to solve seemingly insurmountable problems with cunning and manoeuvring. Southern Railway owned the Southampton docks that the proposed sister ships would have to use, and the company refused to spend the approximate £2 million required in building a new dry dock just for the two new superliners. Since the insurance scheme had not yet been completed and the contract signed, Bates pressured the government by intoning that the agreement, which was by now critical to national prestige, couldn't be signed without a dry dock lined up for use. The move worked. With mounting pressure from the government, Southern Railway's general manager, Sir Herbert Walker, caved and agreed to spend a fortune on creating a brand new dry dock, over 1,000 feet long, 135 feet wide, and almost 50 feet deep. This would go on to become the famous King George V graving dock. So it was that just before Christmas in 1930, the first rivet was driven into the keel of the as yet unnamed liner, known only as 534, the first of the proposed pair, and by the end of the month, the entire keel had been laid. Original designs for the ship drew heavily from Aquitania, featuring a counter-stern and split superstructure towers aft, but 22 scale models had been tested during design, each over 200 inches long. 8,000 trials in simulated wave tanks had refined the hull shape. The ship would feature a flared bow and cruiser stern. The journal Marine Engine Builder stated that when travelling at speed into a head sea, the vessel will ride well, and the water will be effectively and naturally thrown clear and thus prevented from breaking on board. Work carried on into 1931, but now the reality of global economic depression was beginning to sink in, and Cunard, originally flush with cash in a healthy market, was met with a stark reality. There was not enough revenue left to finish the job on hull 534. British transatlantic earnings had fallen over halfway from £9 million to £4 million, and Cunard's directors were left with only one tragic course of action. A fortnight before Christmas 1931, just 1 year since construction had begun, the John Brown Yard's whistle blew and 3,500 workers were sent home for good. Construction was halted. The ship, her frames already plated with steel, loomed over Clydebank like a ghostly figure, an ever-present reminder of the global downturn in fortunes. Without jobs and work, many families in Clydebank were faced with poverty and a steady decline in living conditions. Into 1932, children were being sent to school with half a slice of bread to eat all day. Malnourishment became a terrifying reality. Cunard's problems continued to mount. Norddeutsche Lloyd's Bremen and Europa were plying the Atlantic almost unencumbered, while again it was left to Mauretania, Aquitania and Berengaria to shoulder the burden of regular passenger service, although passenger numbers were dwindling. Cunard's profits plummeted. In 1932, wide-sweeping salary reductions were announced, even for directors. This problem was not just localised to Cunard. The entire British passenger ship industry was suffering. White Star Line's equivalent to the Cunard Big Three were Olympic, Homeric and Majestic, an arguably even more ragtag trio of oceanliners whose origins were mostly pre-war. White Star had planned and begun to lay down the hull for their own superliner, the massive motor vessel Oceanic, but the project too was halted and never completed. By contrast, Italian lines Conte di Savoia and Rex were now also plying the Atlantic alongside the likes of Bremen and Europa, earning considerable profits. Britain's dominance of the sea so long a source of national pride, was now dangerously at risk. In October 1932, Neville Chamberlain, the future Prime Minister of Britain, invited the Scottish industrialist Lord Weir to review and consider the state of British shipbuilding and passenger ship services. The outlook was grim. Weir established that foreign governments were subsidising the construction and operation of their country's liners to a considerable extent. He recommended that money should be lent to Cunard for the completion of 534. But there was an infamous catch. Chamberlain himself wrote in a 1932 diary entry that "My own aim has always been to use the 534 as a lever for bringing about a merger between the Cunard and the White Star lines, thus establishing a strong British firm in the North Atlantic trade." The proposed loan, over £9 million at very low interest, would see the two legendary lines merge together to create a united front on the transatlantic passenger battleground. It must be said that this was a bit of a risky move, because it removed a crucial element from the mix: healthy competition, the natural state that had existed between Cunard and White Star for decades, and had seen each line improving the standards and sizes of their ships in turn in a seemingly never-ending game of one-upsmanship. The matter went to Parliament, who had to approve the monumental loan to a private corporation at a time when many Britons were starving. Scottish politician David Kirkwood's eloquent arguments helped sway those opposed. In lengthy and impassioned appeals to reason, he cited the many corners of Britain from which Hull 534's components had come: the huge stem castings from Darlington, the turbines from Rugby, the high-pressure tubes from Walsall, the 100,000 pieces of cutlery from Sheffield, the propellers from Millwall in London. He ended by saying that from 9,000 to 10,000 men will be employed right away from all over the country. Within a week, in Clydebank alone, anything from 1,000 to 1,500 men will be started. This brilliantly turned the narrative from one of outrage and shock at a mammoth loan being given out to unrestrained capitalists, to being a matter of job creation and national pride. Conservative politician Sir Joseph North chipped in with his own take when he said that, "I well remember a little over a year ago coming back from New York in the Mauritania. I do not think I've ever felt so depressed at the position which this country seemed to be occupying, as, upon a Sunday morning, in a fairly still sea, with a mist, the Mauritania was running almost parallel with the Ile-de-France, when away in the mist appeared the Bremen, which in an hour had overtaken both ships. The old Mauritania, still the fastest of the British ships on the North Atlantic run, was over 25 years old." Incredibly, the bill passed on March 27, 1934, nearly 3 years since construction had started on the ship in the first place, and almost 10 years since plans for her had begun to be drawn up. All over Clydebank, letters were sent recalling men to work after years of inactivity. Over 1,000 men marched back to work again, being guided by pipers, and over them loomed the vast hulk of Hull 534, rusted and inhabited only by colonies of seabirds and ravens. Soon, she would be the site of extraordinary technological achievement, the height of luxury at sea. She would not be Hull 534 forever, but the Queen Mary. It's April 1936, and just off the Isle of Arran, Scotland, a huge ocean liner is being put through its paces. These are the ship's sea trials, and on board are representatives from both the shipbuilder, John Brown and Company, and the future owners, the Cunard Line. On the bridge is the vessel's captain, Sir Edgar Britton. He had started as a young man at sea aboard a 1,000-ton sailing ship. Now, he commands an 80,000-ton behemoth. As the liner's engines are worked up to full power, her name gleams in the sunlight: Queen Mary. This was a triumphal moment for all involved, but just a few short years earlier, the great ship's hull had sat empty and rusting on the slipway, unfinished thanks to the Great Depression. This is the story of how the master shipbuilding company, John Brown, turned that hulk into one of the greatest ocean liners of all time, the mighty RMS Queen Mary. John Brown was a legendary shipbuilding company, and they had built some of the world's largest and most famous ships, from ocean liners like Lusitania and Aquitania to the warships HMS Hood and Renown. They were situated in Scotland at Clydebank, which is a little over 9 kilometres or 5 miles from Glasgow on the Clyde River. Here's an overhead view of the shipyard in 1934. You can see that Queen Mary is being constructed here. In the spring of 1934, you could have stood over here across from the fitting out wharf and watched the mighty hull of the Queen Mary taking shape. For over 2 years now, the ship had loomed over the town like a giant. Now it was up to John Brown's workers to finish the vessel and send her on her way. To understand the magnitude of the task ahead, we first need to get some understanding of what state the Queen Mary was in by that April of 1934. At the time they had put down tools way back in 1931, Queen Mary's hull had only just taken on its fundamental form. As with all ships, the workers had started with the keel in 1930. This was the ship's backbone, and it comprised a steel girder running the majority of the ship's 1,019-foot length. And it was riveted atop 3 layers of keel plate, which was about 3.5 inches thick. Flanking either side of the keel were 7 longitudinal girders, and then a web of floors were riveted to these, and plating installed on top of the structure and underneath. This formed the ship's double bottom, which was cellular and largely watertight. And from here, the huge transverse frames could be attached. These steel beasts gave Queen Mary's hull its shape, and they were spaced apart 36 inches amidships, narrowing to only 24 inches at the extreme bow and stern. This was to give the ship some flexibility when sailing through rough seas. A more rigid construction, brought about by frames being too closely spaced, could cause catastrophic failure and a broken back. Every third frame on Queen Mary was a web frame, which was heavily reinforced by plating to provide some additional rigidity. Because of Queen Mary's immense size, she would have more web frames than was usual. Long support structures called stringers were riveted to the frames, and all this steel would form a basis for a ship that was both immensely strong and very flexible in heavy seas. Then came the hull plates, huge, flat pieces of steel riveted together to form the ship's skin, both inside and out. They originated at the keel plate, and individual hull plates were lined in vast rows called strakes. The one either side of the keel was known as the garboard strake, and then each strake from there received its own letter designation in alphabetical order as they worked their way up the hull. The plates were riveted together with dozens of rivets each, often in 2 or 3 rows, and all of these rivet holes had to be individually punched out of the steel by a specialist machine with pinpoint accuracy. Then the riveters would get to work, pounding red-hot iron rivets into the holes and therefore fastening the steel together. This work continued down the length of the ship, and as the plating continued, wood logs were put in place to shore up the ship and make sure that it couldn't move on the slipway. Scaffolding then slowly began to rise stories into the air so that workers could continue to rivet the hull together. Meanwhile, at the extreme ends of the ship, 2 monumental pieces of engineering achievement were fitted. These were the stem castings, and they formed the very tip of the ship's bow and stern. They were actually the biggest yet made, and the forge that produced them, Darlington, had to make some considerable investment in their works to even complete the order. This was a masterstroke of engineering and pure craftsmanship. The castings that arrived by rail in sections at John Brown were immense, the bow stem casting itself being 130 feet long and rising to about the height of a 10-story building once assembled. In between the frames, holes were cut into the shell plating for the thousands of portholes which would provide light into the ship's hull for staterooms and public spaces. Even at this stage of construction, millions of rivets had been used, and eventually, a total of some 12 million rivets, weighing a combined estimated total of 4,000 tons, would be needed to hold the vast ship together. The rivets alone weighed almost as much as the total displacement of 2 Fletcher-class destroyers. This work, laying the keel, assembling the frames, and plating the hull, went on and was about 80% complete when the shipyard was forced to shut down thanks to the Great Depression in December of 1931. When John Brown and Company's workers finally returned those 2 years, 4 months later, they picked up from where they left off, and the ship's hull was complete and finally ready for launch by September of 1934. Even though the hull was empty and carried none of the immense boilers and machinery that would power it through the water, she already weighed as much as 36,000 tons. Getting this enormous mass safely into the water for the first time would be no easy feat, and it took a significant amount of planning and preparation in itself. The Queen Mary was being built on the slipway here, but at 1,019 feet long, there was a real danger that she would run aground on the opposite side of the Clyde River after launching. To remedy this, two things had to happen. First, 5 acres of the Clyde and Cart banks had to be dredged to widen and deepen them enough so that the Queen Mary wouldn't become stuck. And secondly, thousands of tons of dead weight would need to be fixed to the ship's hull so that it was tethered to the slipway and would stop dead in its tracks as soon as it was afloat. 2,350 tons of drag chains would therefore be used to keep the ship from running aground. Careful calculations were pored over by the John Brown team. With an empty hull weighing some 36,000 tons, they estimated that she would travel 1,194 feet, and this had to even be tested with a model. Then, after launch, the ship would be guided by tugs here to the fitting out basin so that all of her heavy machinery could be installed, as well as her lavish interiors. On September 26, 1934, the big day finally came, and a huge crowd of some 200,000 people flocked to see the event, even though it was raining. To convey the ship's sheer scale, John Brown employed an old tactic, painting the hull a brilliant white, so that she would stand out more against the drab city background in black and white photographs. King George V and his wife, Queen Mary of Teck, ascended the launching platform. Until then, the ship's name had been a secret, and it had only been referred to as Hull Number 534. But then, Queen Mary of Teck cut the ribbon, announcing the ship was named after her instead, the name having been picked as a break from tradition and a step in a fresh new direction. There was a loud cheer as a bottle of Australian sparkling wine smashed on the ship's bow, and then a dull rumble as the ship's huge hull began to slide down the slipway, which had been coated in tallow to make the task easier. This was a critical moment. The hull was about to undergo huge stresses, more than it ever would in its entire career at sea. The builders held their breath as Queen Mary hit the critical point, with half of her hull afloat in the river and the other half still up on the slipway. This caused her hull to bend up by almost 8 inches and then eventually sag down by 2. A weaker ship could have probably broken in half, but Queen Mary's builders had stiffened the hull with girders, and they had also delayed cutting openings like windows and doors into the superstructure on top of the hull to provide additional support. In about 100 seconds, the vast white hull of the Queen Mary was afloat for the first time, and cheers filled the air. Her bulk sent up a 2-foot wave, which flooded out the spectator stands on the opposite side of the river, and in the end, the launching model had proved incredibly accurate. Her builders had predicted that she would travel 1,194 feet before coming to a rest, and in reality, she only exceeded this distance by 2 feet. With Queen Mary moored at the fitting out wharf, workers could finally swarm aboard to begin outfitting the ship's machinery, and what machinery it was. Everything about the Queen Mary was of immense scale and incredible accuracy. Her rudder was the largest yet built and weighed 150 tons by itself. The 4 manganese bronze propellers each weighed around 35 tons and stretched 20 feet across. The slightest error in their casting would have cost the shipbuilders more than $330,000 in today's money. 5 60-ton gear wheels for the turbine engines had their teeth ground in to 1,000th of an inch of accuracy over the course of 2 months each. The anchors were the largest built for a liner and weighed 16 tons each, and to lessen the effect of wind resistance, a cutout was made so that they could sit recessed into the hull. Huge cranes lifted the immense boilers up and down into the ship's bowels. 24 Yarrow boilers went in, as well as the 4 Parsons turbine sets. Steam from the boilers would be superheated to 700 degrees Fahrenheit and course through the lines at 400 pounds per square inch. This steam would send the turbine's rotors, which themselves weighed 40 tons, spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute, and the engines could output 50,000 horsepower each. Down into the ship's bowels went the 4 Weir condensers, massive units with 41,000 square feet of cooling surface designed to turn exhaust steam back into water and recirculate it. Then there were 4 turbo generators by British Thomson Houston, which would power Queen Mary's lights. And there were even installed 2 emergency kerosene generators that on their own could provide power for all the ship's services for 36 hours in the case of an emergency. All of these huge pieces of machinery, each of them extremely expensive and specialised, was lifted with care into the Queen Mary and fixed into place. Then work could commence on the superstructure and the interiors. Public rooms had their walls, or bulkheads, riveted into place. Corridors and vast interior rooms suddenly appeared as walls were installed. A network of ventilation trunking provided fresh air to the ship's inside, and these would be connected to enormous intakes and fans on the boat deck, which could suck in immense amounts of air to adequately ventilate the Mary's 80,000-ton interior space. This work at the fitting out wharf went on for 20 months, and slowly but surely, the hulk was turned into a ship. Then 3 funnels, each of them wide enough to drive 3 locomotives through abreast, were lifted and riveted into place. All 3 of the funnels were actually of different heights, and they got shorter sequentially, but the forwardmost funnel was the height of a 7-story building. They were fitted with steam-powered Typhon whistles, whose deep rumble could be heard more than 10 miles away. They were tuned down to the absurdly low pitch of base A, so as not to disturb passengers on deck, and to convey Queen Mary's huge size. Each of the 3 whistles weighed a ton by themselves. While all this work was going on outside the ship, work was intensifying inside as well. Hundreds and hundreds of passenger staterooms, bathrooms, and public spaces had to be constructed to the highest possible standard, and no expense was spared. The ship's interiors would be decorated with dozens of species of timber, including ebony, jacaranda, zebra, mahogany, violetwood, sycamore, elm, birch, about 56 species in total. Then there was the art. Vast oils, carved gesso panels, etched glass and bronze reliefs, murals by painters and cartoonists. The first-class veranda grille, for example, featured a mural by Doris Zinkhuisen that was 1,000 feet square. Down on D-deck was installed the 2-story palatial tiled swimming pool, completed with balconies and a simulated mother-of-pearl ceiling. And in the cabin-class restaurant, a monumental map depicting the North Atlantic with a miniature crystal replica of the ship indicating its exact position on the route. The interior decor was, for want of a better word, a bit weird. Cunard erred on the side of tradition, as always, but they did not want to put Queen Mary to sea with the kinds of stately Edwardian interiors you'd expect from the Aquitania. The result was a mix match of deco and modernism and traditional Britishness. Said one critic at the time, "The pictures and sculpture are varied in kind and quality, and not all of them fit happily into their setting. The general effect is one of mild but expensive vulgarity." At the time, this gave Sir Percy Bates, Cunard's chairman, cause for concern, but in the end, the strange combination proved endearing, and passengers found Queen Mary to be comfortable and homely. The exterior architecture of the ship was also a curious balance of old and new. Her 3 funnels echoed the design of her running mate Berengaria, but they were proportionally squatter. She didn't have Aquitania or Mauritania's massive, goofy cowl vents, but in their place, she had massive rectangular units instead. Her bridge front also echoed Mauritania and Lusitania with its elegant, sweeping curve. And instead of an Edwardian clipper stern, she sported a modern, cruiser-type stern instead. With the ship nearing completion, 20 lifeboats, each the size of a motor yacht, powered by diesel engines and with capacity for 145 people, were installed on modern electric gravity davits, which could be lowered quickly and safely. 2 additional boats with reduced capacity could carry their own wireless sets, and 2 more lifeboats were kept readied for emergencies, such as a man overboard. A single lifeboat from the Queen Mary could carry all of the passengers of the Cunard Line's first steamship, the Britannia. Constructing the Queen Mary was a monumental achievement, one that was almost never finished. But finally, in April 1936, the ship was guided down the Clyde by tugs for her sea trials before departing on her maiden voyage. Her engines roaring at full power, Captain Sir Edgar Britton's eyes must have smarted against the chill Scottish spring air as Queen Mary glided through the waves at speed. She was a shipbuilding triumph, a win for Britain as a whole, and undoubtedly the pride of Scotland. May 27th, 1936. The RMS Queen Mary has departed Southampton on her maiden voyage. Aboard her are 1,849 passengers and 1,100 crew. The cream of society has sought desperately to board this ship for the special occasion, and as the ship's turbines are run up to full power for the first time in her service career, Queen Mary's bow slices through the water like a knife through hot butter. The question on everybody's mind is this: will the ship beat the Normandy? Just 1 year earlier, France's new superliner had taken the honorific blue ribbon by beating the Italian liner Rex's speed record in carrying out the fastest transatlantic crossing, reaching New York from Southampton in just 4 days and 3 hours. Britain had to answer this challenge, and it would be the Queen Mary that would try it. But could she beat the French liner? Would the engines be powerful enough to pull it off? What design features of the two ships set them apart? The world held its breath and watched the start of one of the greatest shipping rivalries of all time. This epic story has its start in the time just after the First World War. As always, wartime had been a proving ground for new technologies. Before the war, many passenger ships had been built with triple expansion steam engines. These beasts comprised towering pistons driven by steam, but they were mechanically complex and could only achieve moderate speeds. The turbine had been introduced and adopted by many shipping companies before the war as a replacement. It was immensely powerful, relatively compact, and could achieve enormous speeds. The war had proved the turbine's dominance. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had travelled great distances at high speeds powered by turbines. They would be the way of the future. At the same time as this heady technological era when the sky was no longer the limit, the victorious Allied powers, France, Britain, and America, were riding a surge of patriotic nationalism at home. Britain and America had incurred huge shipping losses and were awarded 3 of the most modern ships built by Germany: Imperator, Vaterland, and Bismarck, which were also by far the largest ships afloat. By contrast, France was left with an aging ocean liner fleet. Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, also known as the French Line, had lost 30 ships in the conflict and rushed to replace them with some clapped-out freighters. They were not awarded one of Germany's superliners, but 3 small freighters and another 3 smaller steamships. The country that had lost 1,700,000 dead, almost 5% of their entire population, was left to pick up the pieces themselves, and French Line had grand plans. The early 20s saw the company planning and building a series of increasingly impressive ships. First was the SS Paris of 1921, the new flagship. She was not the largest or the fastest ship in the world. French Line was not in a position to challenge those titles, but she was magnificently appointed and finely built. This set a pattern for the line, and they applied this formula throughout the decade to their other liners, the de Gracie in 1924 and the vaunted Ile-de-France in 1927. By contrast, Britain's major passenger carriers like Cunard and White Star were still relying heavily on their famed pre-war fleet, as well as the newer German additions. Cunard had Mauretania, Aquitania, and Berengaria, a trio of liners totaling some 130,000 odd tons of shipping, while White Star Line boasted the largest trio of ships by tonnage in the world and 137,551 gross registered tons: the Olympic, the Homeric, and Majestic, the largest ship in the world. These were transatlantic heavyweights, and the ships were household names, almost every one a legend in their own right. French Line's offering was extremely modest by comparison, but if the company was to compete on the world stage, they would need to build a ship the likes of which had never yet been seen. She would have to be the largest and fastest ship in the world. From the ruin of wartime, French Line's fleet of humble liners had proved profitable. By the end of the 1920s, the company was well placed to challenge the British competition, and plans were laid for France's own superliner. At first, she was called only T6, and the hull that began to form on the Chantier Atlantique slipway at Saint-Nazaire, France, would have looked totally alien because of its bizarre shape. The hull's flared curves and strange shape was the brainchild of a Russian émigré, Vladimir Yurkovich. The engineer had started out working in Russia on Dreadnought battleships for the Navy after the Russians lost their fleet in the infamous 1905 Battle of Tsushima. During this time, Yorkovich seized upon hydrodynamics and how water impacts ships as they sail through it. Ships' hulls below the waterline until then had been nice and streamlined, but there was a limit to how streamlined they could be. The ship's bow needs to have enough mass so as to be buoyant enough in heavy seas and actually float. Streamline the hull beneath the water enough and it would cut through the ocean like a knife, but the ship would be dangerously unstable, prone to pitching up and down, and easily submerged in heavy seas. Yorkovich sought to solve this by providing a broader midship section and exaggerated tumble home, where the hull gets progressively wider as it reaches the waterline. By the 1920s, he was living and working in France, a fitter and a turner at the Renault car factory, but everything changed when he was taken on as a draftsman at the Chantier Atlantique shipyard. When he found out the French line was working on initial plans for a superliner, he approached them with his hull design. The company was at first skeptical, but he received backing from a Russian-French admiral, and the company agreed to test his hull with models in a tank in Germany. The results were fascinating. His hull design was capable of achieving high speeds with 20% less power than a more traditional design. His concept was formally adopted in 1929, and France's new liner would feature this radical new hull form. Here's how it was supposed to work. For a ship designed for speed, the enemy is always drag. Drag can come in three major forms: below the waterline, at the waterline, and above it. Below the waterline, the ship's massive hull has to push through the ocean at a rate of knots, so the hull form has to be sleek and streamlined to make this as easy as possible. Meanwhile, at the waterline, the ship experiences the destructive interference of waves. The bow itself creates a wave which breaks along the side of the ship, creating drag and slowing it down. Then, the very shape of the ship's hull and superstructure above the waterline is moved through the air at speed and creates aerial drag. Everything must be made as efficient as possible if the superliner is going to be able to beat the standing speed record. One single knot, or 1.15 miles per hour, could make all the difference. To solve for the first of the three main drag creators, Yorkovich provided the new ship with a knife-edge bow of extremely thin profile. Normally, this would of course lessen the ship's buoyancy, but to account for it, the ship's hull featured an enormous midsection. Normandy boasted an extremely long and fine bow below the waterline that suddenly flared out to its full amidships width. As well as this, the bow above the waterline flared out and up, providing more mass and ensuring the ship would not be at danger of pitching dangerously up and down. By contrast, the Mauretania, a ship which had long held the transatlantic speed record, featured a conventional hull design with no flare and a prow, or very front, which was almost perfectly straight. With so little mass at her bow, the ship was known as a pitcher and would often alarmingly drop straight down and seemingly at random, even in relatively calm seas. This new French ship, by contrast, would provide a smooth ride, and the wide midsection would reduce rolling from side to side as well. Next, Yorkovich solved the wave problem as well. The new ship's hull featured a bulbous bow. Conventional ships' bows carved their way through the ocean and threw up enormous waves as they did it, which broke along the ship's side and slowed them down. The French liner's bulbous bow would act ahead of the ship's prow, disrupting the flow of water and cancelling out the bow wave, thus reducing drag. Even at full speed, Normandy would create only the tiniest of bow waves as it glided through the water. Last, there was the above-water drag. Normandy's superstructure, which was extremely long thanks to the ship's huge midsection, some 734 feet, or over 70% of the ship's length, was dramatically curved at the front end, and the funnels, instead of being cylindrical, were constructed in a teardrop shape to better channel air as it flowed past. The third funnel, a dummy of sorts because it wasn't connected to the boiler uptakes, was so placed to disrupt the flow of air and more efficiently displace it along the ship's massive length. Every aspect of the ship's layout worked in conjunction to provide greater efficiency, and there was good reason for it. Britain and America's shipyards had output some of the most modern ships afloat, and as long-time adopters of the steam turbine, they had simply perfected the art. British and American steam turbines were easily the most powerful and effective afloat, and French line may not have felt fully confident in challenging this dominance. A more radical propulsion method was chosen. The new ship would be turbo-electric, with steam turbines creating electricity for motors, which would then drive the ship's propellers. The system allowed for full power to be used in reverse without the need for dedicated astern turbines or complex and delicate gearing, and it was quieter and more easily maintained. Instead of relying on brute horsepower, the new ship's sleek hull would mean less power would be needed to break the speed record. What French line introduced to much fanfare in 1935 was easily the world's largest ship. White Star Line's RMS Majestic was a 56,000-ton steamer, but the new French ship dwarfed her at almost 80,000 gross registered tons. The ship was essentially a floating palace, kitted out with the latest Art Deco interiors and the very finest fittings French craftsmanship had to offer. Early on, her construction, heavily subsidised by the government, had been a huge source of contention in France, but now, as this new superliner proudly steamed out on her maiden voyage with the tricolour fluttering in the breeze, it all seemed worthwhile. She was named Normandy, the largest ship in the world to be sure, but would she be the fastest? Departing Southampton, Normandy's engines were gradually worked up to full speed, and her hull barely made a ripple as it sliced through the waves. From the outside, the ship looked incredibly elegant, but deep down, there were actually problems. The ship's stern section vibrated badly, even at half power, and the cause was as yet a mystery. And then, on the first day, a condenser tube ruptured and drained the ship of 25% of her power while works were carried out. But despite this, Normandy recorded more and more miles every day. On day 2, it was 718 miles, but by day 4, it was 754. The ship's passengers and crew were sure they'd broken the speed record and won the symbolic blue ribbon, and on June 2nd, the passengers dressed in blue, and a 98-foot-long blue banner was flown from the mast. Normandy glided into New York Harbor only 4 days, 3 hours and 2 minutes since passing Bishop's Rock at an average speed of 29.98 knots. She'd done it. France had won the blue ribbon, and Normandy was the largest and fastest ship in the world. For the Cunard Line, this French victory was a bit of a blow. From the outset, their proposed new pair of superliners, what would eventually become the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, were intended to be the largest and fastest ships on the transatlantic trade. Traditionally, the route was serviced by trios because it made the most sense. Think of it a little like a bus route. In order to offer the most reliable and regular passenger service, 3 ships work best. Sailing at 20 to 25 knots on average, the ships could make decent time, and with 3 liners, one ship could be sailing west to America, another sailing east to Europe, and a third crossing in either direction or in for repair with no major impact on the schedule. Cunard wanted to shake this up and replace the 3 large ships they already operated with 2 larger, faster ships that would be big and quick enough to maintain a regular service on their own. The design philosophy behind the pair was outlined by Cunard chairman Percy Bates, who said that the speed is dictated by the time necessary to perform the journey at all seasons of the year and in both directions, plus the consideration of the number of hours required in port on each side of the Atlantic. The size is dictated by the necessity to make money by providing sufficient saleable passenger accommodation to pay for the speed. So in this way, the speed drove the ship's size. But from the outside, making the largest and fastest ships in the world wasn't just good PR for Cunard. Bates said that instead of just competing for size and speed for the sake of it, the 2 new ships would really be the smallest and slowest, which can fulfill properly all the essential economic conditions. But this was a little disingenuous. The British government was backing the construction of the Queen Mary and had saved it from cancellation during the Great Depression. The expectation was that the new ship would maintain Britain's dominance over the transatlantic trade, and all eyes were on the John Brown shipyard where, as Normandy made its record-breaking dash across the Atlantic, the Queen Mary was being finalised. From the outside, the differences between Queen Mary and Normandy are stark. Normandy bears little resemblance to the ships that came before her. Queen Mary, on the other hand, deliberately borrowed and expanded upon design cues from older ships like the Mauretania, like the very front of the bridge here. On top of this, where Normandy's decks were clean and open, with most of the big fans and ventilators obscured behind panelling or in the funnels, Queen Mary's decks were cluttered full of huge air vents and equipment in the tradition of older Cunard liners like the Aquitania. Cunard was not in the business of reinventing the wheel or breaking with tradition, so when it came to Queen Mary, very few radical decisions were made. This was most evident in the hull design. Queen Mary would not have a bulbous bow and her lines would be long and traditional. Where Normandy featured a sweeping, superfine bow profile beneath the waterline, Queen Mary's was comparatively thicker. The Mary's hull was sleek and streamlined to be sure, and it had actually been tested with 22 models in water tanks over the course of 8,000 tests. The bow flared out and featured a prominent rake, which meant pitching up and down would be minimalised, but at sea trials the ship threw up an enormous bow wave, almost the height of a 3 or 4 story building at full speed, meaning the hull form lacked the refined efficiency of the Normandy. In fact, it was down in the engine room where Queen Mary's trump card lay. Normandy's turbo-electric engines were novel and fairly advanced and output around 160,000 horsepower in total, but Queen Mary was fitted with 4 massive Parsons turbines, tried and tested, and capable of putting out some 212,000 shaft horsepower, the equivalent of 7 million rowers. The arrangement required an enormous power train comprising 4 primary boiler rooms, each containing 6 massive Yarrow boilers for the propulsion, an auxiliary boiler room with 3 Scotch boilers to generate electrical power for the ship's services, 2 turbo generator rooms, and then the 2 engine rooms. This power plant consumed the majority of the space of the bottom 4 or 5 decks of the ship for its entire 1,019-foot length. In May 1936, Queen Mary was ready at last for her maiden voyage. Sea trials had proved promising and the ship hit in excess of 32 knots, but the question still remained: could Queen Mary beat Normandy's speed? Unfortunately, the maiden voyage would not provide the answer. Initially running at a decent speed, the Mary encountered fog on the final day of the crossing, and she reached New York only 2 hours behind Normandy's record. Queen Mary had not decisively crushed the French ship's speed on her inaugural crossing, but even in the face of fog-induced delays, she had come dangerously close. French line was sweating. Despite the fact it had been such a close-run thing, there was an air of gloom around Mary's inability to beat Normandy on that first crossing. Cunard swore that they had not even been trying to do so, but even then the pressure was on. The Mary's monstrous turbines were worked up to full speed again in August 1936 for another crossing, and the Normandy's record was finally beaten by 2 hours and 35 minutes. French line's directors were dejected, but they would not give up hope. One of the greatest maritime rivalries of all time had begun, and the margin of victory, just over 2 hours, was very slim. Improvements were made to Normandy throughout the winter of 1936 to 1937, with boiler efficiency increased and a new set of 4-bladed propellers fitted to the ship instead of her older 3-bladed ones. And the result was impressive. Normandy beat Queen Mary's time in May 1937, crossing the Atlantic in just 3 days and 23 minutes. Her engines pushed to output power very close to Queen Mary's turbines. On the return voyage, Normandy's turbo-electric engines actually output 195,850 developed horsepower on the final day. Clearly, the improvements had worked. Normandy once again held the blue ribbons, but Cunard and Queen Mary had an answer. See, Normandy was not the only ship to receive modifications to help her speed along. A set of 4 18-foot wide manganese bronze propellers were crafted for the ship, more efficient than her original set. And in August 1938, Queen Mary's crew again pushed her engines to full power, and the ship ended Normandy's reign, cruising into New York over 2 hours earlier than the French ship's fastest time. Normandy's skipper sent a message through: "Bravo to the Queen Mary, until next time." But there would be no next time. This rivalry could have gone on for years because, again, the margin for Queen Mary's victory was so slim. But then in September 1939, just a year after Queen Mary's win, everything changed. While Britain and France's superliners had duelled on the Atlantic, Nazi Germany had plunged Europe into fear by expanding into neighbouring territories and annexing Czechoslovakia and Austria. War seemed a grim inevitability, and transatlantic trips on the Normandy and the Queen Mary were savoured as if to be a little escape from reality. On August 23, 1939, Normandy left Le Havre on a regular, scheduled crossing, but she would never return. On September 1st, war broke out when Hitler's armies invaded Poland, and the frivolous peacetime transatlantic rivalries between France and Britain were ended. In 1940, French and British soldiers fought and died side by side when the German army swept into France, and with the country's occupation, Normandy became a refugee ship without a home. Mothballed in New York Harbor for years, the ship was requisitioned by the US Navy for conversion into a troop ship, but it was completely bungled. A fire broke out in 1942, and the ship capsized. By contrast, Queen Mary's immense speed was to play a vital role in her wartime career, and it was her greatest asset. Alongside her new sister ship, Queen Elizabeth, the great speed that Cunard chairman Percy Bates had considered crucial in maintaining a regular peacetime transatlantic schedule would now see the two sister ships become some of the most highly valued Allied troop transports of the war and the most sought-after target of Hitler's navy. July 24th, 1915, a Saturday in Chicago, Illinois. A surprisingly mild day in the middle of summer. Just the day before, it had been 10 degrees higher. Thunderstorms swept sporadically across the city, keeping many inside, but down at the Chicago River, between LaSalle and Clark Street, the riverfront was bustling with activity. Hundreds of people are crowded, excitedly stepping aboard an excursion steamer that's going to take them for a day of fun. Directly across the river looms the red brick facade and the beautiful clock tower of the brand new Reed, Murdoch & Co. office building. Those working through the weekend there have a good view directly opposite as the excursion steamer loads its human cargo, but any keen-eyed observers might have noticed it beginning to wallow in the water, leaning this way and that. No matter, small steamers came and went from here every day. With loading about complete, one final passenger jumps between shore and a ship. On the upper deck, a small band plays lively ragtime tunes. Then, as the little white ship begins to cast off from the wharf, it rolls, sluggishly, but quickly enough to catch the musicians off guard. Their music stops as they fall, and the ship lurches heavily. In plain daylight, within full view of the Chicago riverfront and the workers across the way, the ship has capsized. It had barely cleared the wharf. The sinking of SS Eastland has become legend in Chicago, where its sudden, violent loss is an unusually horrific chapter in the city's history. The sinking was bad enough, but the revelations that would come later, the causes of the disaster, would outrage the public and shock even to this day. This is the tragic story of the sinking of the SS Eastland. The Great Lakes are like an immense inland sea, providing a vital waterway to link major cities like Chicago, Buffalo, Michigan, Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and more. For generations, Chicagoans have taken to the lakes on ferries and day trip steamers, but the lakes are no picnic. They can be whipped into frenzied rage by winter storms, or blotted out entirely by dense, impenetrable fog banks. It's thought that between 10 to 20,000 ships or more have been taken by them. In the early morning of July 24, 1915, the sleek, white hull of an excursion steamer rose up from the Chicago River. On the bow of the unusually tall hull, in neat, small letters, was the name Eastland. And of the hundreds of people who crowded aboard that day, not one of them knew that a series of ill-informed decisions and poor design choices had ensured that this morning would probably be their last. The SS Eastland was a passenger ship designed for the lakes. Known as the Great Lakes Speed Queen, she was launched in 1903. For decades, there'd been a bustling passenger trade across the lakes, so countless ferries and steamers were built to capitalise on the demand, operating voyages to link railheads and stop at towns and cities along the way. Aside from operating a regular timetable, ferries could be chartered for events and functions as pleasure cruises and day trips became more popular. The SS Eastland's design and construction was a little unorthodox, and the seeds for the disaster that would occur over 10 years later were sown from the start. The contract for the ship's construction was awarded to the Jenks Shipbuilding Company of Michigan. Now, the shipyard had a history of building freighters and tugboats, and Eastland would be their first and only passenger ship project. Sidney Jenks, the yard's chief designer, consulted with his naval architecture professor from Cornell University on the project, and the pair came up with the outline for their ship. It had a dual purpose, a cargo vessel and a passenger ferry, and it needed to maintain a good turn of speed to keep up the demanding schedule. Capacity for passengers needed to be 500 for overnight voyages, housed comfortably in cabins. But critically, Eastland needed a shallow draft, that is the amount of ship that's below the waterline, to allow it to enter into those shallow ports. The design was finalised, and calculations on the ship's metacentric height and centre of gravity were completed. These all dictate the stability of the ship's final design. But then, the shipyard Jenks, probably at the request of the steamship's future owners, shortened the length by 60 feet and added a passenger deck. Now, this would obviously have a huge impact on the calculations on balance and stability, but apparently no recalculating was done and no further inclining tests on the ship's stability were carried out. The result was a long, thin, tall ship with a design top speed of 20 knots and some quirky habits. Now, from the beginning, Eastland was known to be top-heavy and had a history of stability issues. She would roll this way and that, and something passengers found funny as the steamer limped into or out of port. It meant for the captain and his engineers, operating the ship was a never-ending game of pumping water into and out of ballast tanks to straighten the ship up. Now, this instability was primarily due to Eastland's relatively narrow beam, or the ship's width, in comparison to its length and height. It made it prone to listing from side to side. The narrow beam was a reflection on Eastland's purpose. speed, and efficiency. The beam was one thing, but even more alarming was Eastland's shallow draft. To compensate for a high centre of gravity, designers can give the ship more draft. That's simply more of it under the waterline to ensure stability. Back then, designers of the age set about 60% of the hull below the waterline, but this created more drag and the engines had to work harder. Now, Eastland's draft was already shallow, far less than the usual 60%, but after her inaugural season in 1903, the ship's draft was reduced even further in an effort to gain even more speed. The ship was built for efficiency. As an engineer later put it, the idea was to save coal by keeping the hull as much out of the water as possible. The draft was cut in two. Instead of 60%, only 30% of Eastland's hull could be found below the waterline. Now, the 1903 to 1904 refit reduced the ship's draft and added even more weight above the waterline. Worst of all, Eastland was regularly sailing with well over 2,000 passengers. Measures were taken to try to fix the ship's bad behaviour. The ship's passenger complement was lowered by 200, and some staterooms were taken out. Then, a couple of years later, the remaining cabins were removed because they sat way too high up in the hull, and the funnels were cut down in height. 2 tons of concrete were added lower down to try to balance things out, but still, when loading passengers, the ship was known to dip down in the water by as much as 25 degrees. In August 1913, naval engineer John Devereux York took a voyage on Eastland and was appalled by what he saw. He said, in trying to make the harbour, it was like steering a log of wood. She wouldn't obey the helm. He quickly wrote a letter to the US harbour master of the city's port saying, "You are aware of the condition of the SS Eastland, and unless structural defects are remedied to prevent listing, there may be a serious accident." But he got no response. Now that was already bad enough, but then things got even worse. In response to the Titanic disaster in 1912, new maritime safety regulations were enacted, requiring ships to carry enough lifeboats and rafts for all passengers. For the Eastland, this meant adding additional lifeboats, which would be shipped on the top weather deck. This added tons of weight to the uppermost part of the ship. Now obviously this couldn't go unnoticed, as the already unstable Eastland was renowned for its funny tendency to roll to one side. A. Shantz, general manager of the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, petitioned hard against this change because, as a ferry operator himself, he knew the danger. Eastland was not a unique case. Many of the Great Lakes ships were designed and built in a similar way. If their upper decks were crowded with lifeboats, they were likely to capsize if the conditions were right. He told Congress, "The extra weight of the lifeboats and rafts would make ships of the Great Lakes top-heavy and unseaworthy, and some of them would turn turtle if you attempted to navigate them with this additional weight on the upper decks." Eastland's owners and operators, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, complained about the change as well, with the general manager writing to the Secretary of Commerce in Washington and saying, "If it were possible to put this amount of equipment on the Eastland, the weight that would be added to its upper deck would make the boat difficult to handle." Now this all sounds very noble on behalf of Eastland's owners, but now they had a choice to make. With an unmoved government, they could prove that passenger safety was truly at the heart of their complaints by operating Eastland with fewer lifeboats, but a reduced passenger capacity. Now, fewer passengers meant, of course, lower revenue. Or they could accept the danger, fit more lifeboats, and apply for a permit to raise passenger capacity and earn more revenue. Now, Eastland's owners, of course, chose the latter, increased revenue at the expense of their passengers' safety. With Eastland already top-heavy, dangerously unstable, and crammed with massively heavy boats, the St. Joseph and Chicago Steamship Company made a critical modification that upset her even more. The old wood floor had been ripped up and replaced with a layer of thick concrete. That, plus another concrete pouring further aft, added up to 20 tons of weight above the waterline. The end result was a very cranky ship indeed, and the stage had been set for a disaster of tragic, almost unfathomable proportions. On the morning of July 24th, at 6:30 a.m, Eastland, docked at the Clark Street Bridge, began to take on passengers. The day was planned for a Western Electric Company picnic across Lake Michigan from Chicago to Michigan City, Indiana. Excitement was high, and families arrived early to secure a spot on the ship. Around 7,000 tickets had been sold for the function. Western Electric was just that big of an employer for the city and its surrounds. A total of 5 excursion boats had been chartered for the trip, and hundreds lined up to board Eastland for a day of fun. On the bridge, Captain Harry Paterson supervised loading. He was a short, 55-year-old who'd got his master's license some 14 years earlier and knew Eastland's quirky behaviour quite well. His calm demeanour may have even fooled onlookers into a sense of normality, but all was certainly not well aboard his ship. Passengers tried to shield themselves from the drizzle and poured up the gangways, but then, about 10 to 7, the ship began to show signs of its old instability. As passengers continued to board, the Eastland started to list slightly to starboard, over to the right, indicating the early signs of imbalance. The open gangway doors dropped lower into the river to within just 18 inches or 45 centimetres. Now, this was sufficient to catch the attention of Chief Engineer Joseph Ericsson, but not enough for him to raise the alarm. Incredibly, the chief was just a lad of 23 years old, but he, like Captain Peterson, knew Eastland's quirks all too well. He followed standard procedure, opening 2 portside ballast tanks and flooding them to try to correct the list. Satisfied the issue would resolve itself like it usually did, the engineers got steam on her engines and they thumped suddenly to life. Up above, passengers lined the railings and jammed the small inside spaces of the ship. Bert Cross was a Western Electric employee travelling with 5 co-workers packed shoulder to shoulder on the promenade deck. Nearby, 18-year-old Frank Blaha stood near the rail. He could hear the band playing below his feet, but he was glad to be away from the worst of the crush. Below in the hull, more and more day trippers streamed in at about 50 every minute, and the ship's hull sagged lower and lower into the Brown River. Just 10 minutes later, passenger capacity was reached, and the ship began to list to port up to 15 degrees. Now, this could be attributed to a number of things. For one, around 3/4 of the ship's coal had been incorrectly trimmed and loaded into the port side alone. By flooding the portside ballast tanks, Ericsson was only adding to the improper loading. But even worse, Eastland was probably over passenger capacity. She'd been licensed to carry about 2,570 people, but eyewitnesses suggest there were many more aboard. Chief Engineer Ericsson must have been frustrated the ship was playing up so much. He ordered water discharged from the port ballast tanks, and then the starboard tanks be flooded, but for whatever reason, they refused to work. Passengers were largely unaware of the growing instability, and those that were seemed to laugh it off as a peculiar quirk of the ship. As it rolled this way and that, some oohed and ahed, and all the while the band sawed away at its cellos and bass. So, despite the ship's weird behaviour, the mood of the crowd was light and chirpy. From shore, though, dozens watched puzzled as the ship seemed to lean further and further over onto her port side, while hundreds of people smiled and waved back at them from the decks. But suddenly, unexpectedly, Eastland swung upright onto something nearing an even keel. Maybe the starboard tanks had finally flooded, Ericsson must have thought. This welcome news meant that at 7:20 AM, Captain Peterson was satisfied loading was complete and Eastland could get underway. With a ring, the ship's bell signalled it was time to go, and her lines began to be cast off. But then, the temporary balance was lost, and Eastland began to sag even faster over to port. Passengers were ordered to move to the starboard side because, alarmingly, water had begun to flood into the open portside gangway doors, which were now within reach of the river. Eastland's captain continued the departure though, and the ship's stern began to swing away from the dock. Now this, and the ship's band, which continued to play, tricked passengers into thinking that all was well, and they began to move away from the starboard side railing to watch the departure. But below their feet, it was impossible for the engineers not to notice the problem that they were suddenly facing as water poured in from above. The engines came to a sudden stop, and Eastland hung suspended just a few feet away from the dock. At around 7:27 AM, the ship listed to port up to 30 degrees. Water was now roaring through the gangway doors down into the bottom of the ship, causing crew members from down in the machinery spaces to panic and rush up their escape ladders. Crew up top began moving passengers to the starboard side again, but with much greater difficulty because the weather decks were now wet and slippery from the light rain. Just seconds later, Eastland listed sharply to port up to 45 degrees. Now this time the list was so severe that it became clear the ship was in grave danger of fully capsizing. The piano and the large main refrigerator broke free and fell away to the port side, crushing some passengers. And inside the ship, dishes and glasses smashed off of tables. Passengers and crew scrambled to the main staircase to escape, but it caused a lethal bottleneck, and hardly anyone could get through. Then, nearing 7:30, the inevitable happened, and Eastland capsized. In a matter of seconds, the ship had rolled completely over onto its port side, trapping hundreds of people inside and throwing many from the upper decks into the Chicago River in a heap. As Eastland rolled, dozens and dozens of people had rushed for the main stairwell, but there was a momentous human crush as they jammed into the tight space and there was no getting through. The stairs collapsed altogether and there was no way out. Then the water began to roar in. It wasn't a gentle, gradual fall, it was sudden and violent. The heavy wood bookcases, the piano, unsecured cargo and heavy equipment, it all rolled and wheeled across the deck and pinned people on the other side with a sickening thud. Passengers were thrown bodily over as their ship came down around them. The jauntily panelled interior, just moments earlier a sight of excitement and happiness, was turned suddenly into a scene from hell as people were flung off their feet into one another, and then white water roared in around them. Passenger George Goyette said, "What I saw was exactly what you see when you watch a lot of children rolling down the side of a hill. The entire crowd of men, women and children came slipping and sliding and sprawling down with a mass of lunchboxes, milk bottles, chairs, rubbish of every sort on top of them. They came down in a floundering, screaming mass, and as the boat turned completely over on its side, crashed into the stairs, carrying them away." For those that lined the riverfront, it was a sudden, shocking moment. The sight was absolutely bizarre because with seemingly no warning, no fire or explosion, no dramatic collision or shouts of panic, the ship seemed to simply tip over before the eyes of hundreds of observers at the dockside or from nearby office buildings. Writer Jack Woodford saw it happen and he wrote, "I watched in disoriented stupefaction a steamer large as an ocean liner slowly turned over on its side as though it were a whale going to take a nap. I didn't believe a huge steamer had done this before my eyes, lashed to a dock, in perfectly calm water, in excellent weather, with no explosion, no fire, nothing. I thought I'd gone crazy." 18-year-old Frank Blaha had been up on the promenade deck when he felt the ship start to go out from under him. He later said they had all those loose folding chairs on the ship and all this glass and the piano that all began sliding when the ship started to tip. The people couldn't hold on to anything, it just went down that fast. And the people on that side, the side toward the center of the river, didn't have a chance. They just rolled right under. He and a friend had rushed down the stairs as the ship went over, and they just managed to make it down the side of the hull, so they stood, helpless and dazed, on the exposed side of the ship. Eastland had rolled so suddenly, and yet dozens had ended up suddenly in the water in thick, sodden wool clothes that dragged them down into the murk. Western Electric man Bert Cross said, "The whole river was a mass of struggling humanity when hundreds were drowning before my eyes. You've probably read about it in the papers, but no one can picture the horror of the scene. Men and women covered with blood from broken windows, children and girls struggling in the water calling for help, and the people trapped within the boat who never had a chance for their life." Because Eastland had sunk at her dock, the response was almost instant, with dozens crowding the ship's hull attempting to haul survivors out. The rescue operation was chaotic and heart-rending, with rescuers breaking windows to pull people from the submerged hull. Eastland had rolled in full view, not just of virtually the entire city, but the other chartered steamships, including the Theodore Roosevelt and Petoskey. One lookout from that ship, Peter Boyle, stared on appalled at what he saw. The 26-year-old Irish immigrant had been among a group of officers and men from their ship, which had seen Eastland's listing, and they became uneasy. They'd begun to lower their boats in anticipation of something bad happening, and this keen instinct had been proved right. It meant that almost instantly they got to work and set off to pull people from the water. As one of the boats was going down, Boyle spotted a woman drowning in the water. He dived when the boat was still 15 feet above the river's surface, but he never came back up, either stunned by the impact or held down by a desperate drowning victim. Boyle would be the only victim to die that day who hadn't been aboard the Eastland. Meanwhile, on the Theodore Roosevelt nearby, passengers erupted in panic at the sight of the other ship's loss, and they fought their way off their ship in a frenzied hurry. All around the Eastland's hull, tragic scenes of human suffering were playing out in full view of a stunned crowd ashore. The tug Kenosha, which had been tied up earlier to Eastland's bow in preparation for the departure, made a bridge between the capsized hull and the dock, with the crew hauling people out to safety. A steady, sad stream of people who'd been fortunate enough to make it out and onto the Eastland's overturned hull in time began to march their way off their ship, onto Kenosha, and then onto the wharf. Frank Blaha and his mate just waited until a boat came over to get them. They simply stepped off the overturned hull to safety, but others weren't so fortunate and they had to be bodily hauled out. F.W. Willard was a superintendent of the Western Electric Cable Works, and instead of standing frozen in panic, he rushed to grab a line and started throwing it out to anybody that could catch it. Nearby, another Western Electric man, Howard Wynne, did his best to haul people out of the brackish cold water. "I pulled one old fellow out," he said, on a 2x4 that was at least 2 feet underwater, hanging onto an armchair which refused to sink, so he was floating along about 2 feet under. I got him to the raft and pumped some air into him and then hoisted him on deck of the Petoskey, and when I got up there he was sitting on the cabin floor with his arms around his daughter, whom he had also pulled out, crying and asking for 2 sisters and the mother who were missing. The rescue effort had been tremendous and instantaneous, with absolutely no warning or coordination. Bystanders, passengers and crewmen alike had sprung into action to do their best to help, made all the more remarkable because nobody knew if the boilers, which had steam on them, would explode or not. One group of heavy industry workers nearby had rushed aboard a clapped-out tug and somehow got the old engine to work despite having no formal qualifications or seagoing experience themselves. They still managed to pull in about 50 people from the water. Soon, very soon though, it became clear that all that could be done outside had been done, and hundreds were missing, still trapped inside the steel, coffin-like hull. Inside the ship, divers soon got to work, but they soon realised their mission had become one of body recovery. The interior was confusing and extremely disorienting, with everything now rotated 90 degrees. Dozens and dozens of bodies were found jammed in the bottleneck that had formed at the main staircase leading out of the hull. Some had claimed from the outside they could still hear faint tapping and cries from within, so it became clear that the ship would need to be cut open, and acetylene torch-wielding workers began to slice into the steel, but not without complaint from Eastland's own Captain Pedersen, who had survived, and watched on appalled at how his ship was being treated. "Here, stop that," he had allegedly cried as the steel was rent open, but one worker brushed him off in disgust. "My orders are to save lives," he had said, "not be careful of the boat." What workers found inside was nightmarish. The result of the sinking had been horrific. 844 passengers and crew killed. In fact, more passengers died on Eastland than had died on Titanic 3 years prior. Nearly 230 victims had been teenagers, 58 were little children. 175 women went home that day as widows, 84 men lost their wives. Whole families were gone. 500 or more Western Electric employees had been wiped out. It had all happened just feet from the dock and safety. Footage from the recovery is so distressing, I can't even show you today, 110 years later. It's just that horrendous. But over the coming days, workers struggled to haul people up from deep within the ship, while pressmen and film cameras snapped away just feet away from them on the riverfront. The brand new red brick Reed, Murdoch & Co. office building and warehouse directly across the river suddenly became a morgue with dozens of unidentified dead lining its ground floor. Now the news was a sensation, and even as bodies were being pulled out of the overturned hull, newspapers ran sordid headlines and indicted owners and shipbuilders alike. Engineer John Devereux York, who had written that letter in 1913 to the Chicago harbour master warning of impending disaster, passed his letter on to the local media, furthering the outrage. Of course, the resulting scandal caused furious, justified questions from the outraged public. How could this have happened when Eastland's design was well known to have been dangerous? Why did the owners operate the ship, and how were they allowed to have operated it at all? Questioning began with Jenks, the designers and builders of the ship. Now, it soon became clear that standards of shipbuilding on the lakes had been lax. Sidney Jenks, Eastland's designer, testified that his vessel had only been designed for 500 passengers for the original owners. He said, "I had no way of knowing the quantity of its business after it left our yards." Now, damningly, no inclining test on the ship's stability was ever performed. He said that because the ship had been launched on its side, leant over 45 degrees, and then righted itself again, that it had demonstrated its stability just fine, and that was apparently enough. With 6 members of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company indicted for conspiracy and negligence, Judge Clarence Sessions said that there is no proof which tends, even to a slight degree, to fasten such guilt upon any of the respondents. Every act charged and proved against these respondents was done in the usual and ordinary course of business. In fact, the company's knowledge of Eastland's bad past behaviour seems embarrassingly basic. Back in 1913, during discussions around the sale, no mention of the instability was ever made, nor the major listing incidents from early in the ship's career. At an inquest, Walter C. Steele, the company's secretary-treasurer, said, "I didn't know much about the boat except that we had got it at a bargain. All I do is to sign blank checks." So what had happened? Well, in brief, the government had ordered the installation of additional lifeboats if the company had wished to maintain the massive passenger capacity, something Eastland's original builder later testified she'd never been designed for in the first place. In retrospect, we know that Eastland's owners had complained about their ship's seaworthiness with additional lifeboats fitted, but clearly, in opting to fit additional lifeboats to boost passenger capacity, they had chosen profit over safety. In the event, when Eastland rolled over, the lifeboats were basically useless and more of a hazard than anything else. Many of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company executives had avoided extradition to Illinois, staying in Michigan instead to avoid federal charges, and their extradition was barred by the same judge who had said that every act charged and proved against those respondents was done in the, quote, usual and ordinary course of business. If they truly had no knowledge of their ship's strange behaviours and top-heaviness, then surely they need only have looked at the thing as it pathetically limped and listed 10, 15 degrees from side to side, or even read reports from engineers who were tasked with furiously pumping water in and out of tanks to maintain balance. If they were truly concerned for passenger safety, thanks to the additional lifeboats as they had stated earlier, then surely they should have conducted stability and inclination tests on their ship with the lifeboats fitted, but they never did. Now, if not guilty of deliberate manslaughter, then surely Eastland's owners and operators were guilty of extreme incompetence and negligence, but they were never found guilty and escaped unscathed. Unforgivably, they blamed Eastland's chief engineer Erickson for the disaster and maintained that his counter-flooding of the ballast tanks and attempting to mitigate the listing was the cause of the accident. Cases dragged on and on for 2 decades. In 1919, Erickson, the chief engineer, had died, and he became an easy scapegoat for the disaster. In 1933, the matter was closed at a limitation of liability hearings that concluded astoundingly that Erickson's mishandling of the ballast tanks was the cause of the disaster, and the Eastland was, quote, on the morning of July 24, 1915, seaworthy in every respect, fit for the carriage of passengers, if properly handled. The civil trial determined that a payout to the families of victims should equal the value of Eastland's hull, about $50,000 at the time, but first the owners had to pay out the salvors of the hull, that cost $35,000, then another $15,000 went to creditors, so by the end, there was nothing left. Aid for families actually came from the Western Electric Company, the City of Chicago and the Red Cross, but that was it. There was no watershed reform of maritime safety. In fact, there was no regulatory result at all. Eastland and her 844 victims slipped from the headlines and slowly faded from memory, while the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company and its owners and officers escaped scot-free. This infamous disaster didn't result in any major precedent of law, although it damn well should have. The Eastland's sinking serves as a tragic reminder of what happens when businesses are allowed, unchecked and unregulated, to maintain unsafe standards of practice. In Chicago today, as people hurry and bustle past the LaSalle Street Bridge on their way to work, they could be completely forgiven for missing the metal plaque installed in 2003 that commemorates the tragedy. It's hard to imagine that there, in the middle of that vibrant town, a disaster had taken over 840 lives. There, on the other side of the river, still sits the red-bricked Reed, Murdoch and Co. building, a silent sentinel and witness to one of history's most tragic maritime disasters, the day the Eastland rolled.
Here the Queen Mary slides into Southampton after another transatlantic run. A royal lady come home once more.
Once upon a time, if you wanted to get anywhere in the world, across the roaring Atlantic midwinter, where the waves stand the height of apartment blocks, or way down to Australia over the Indian Ocean and its blistering sun, you would have to board an ocean liner. These magnificent pieces of technology were the toast of their era, and from the 1800s, when they were first introduced, until the mid-20th century they evolved and grew to gargantuan proportions. They served their respective countries heroically in wartime. They transported celebrities and migrants alike in their hundreds of thousands, and they cut the journey across the Atlantic from weeks and weeks to just 3.5 days. Then, they disappeared. Quietly in the background, a technological war had been waged. For half a century, the airplane had grown and evolved too, and then, when the ocean liner was right at its absolute height, the unthinkable happened. Almost overnight, the world's great ocean liners were made redundant. Passenger bookings dropped to nothing. Once celebrated ships were pulled unceremoniously from service and sat rusting awaiting their fates. Overhead, the roar of jet engines sang their swan song. Just how this played out, the key players and companies, is one of the most interesting technological tales of our times. It's a sad tale of redundancy, of what happens when the times move on and leave the marvels of the past behind. And this is how the ocean liner died. The New York Chelsea Piers. Since the turn of the 20th century, this was the gathering place for a veritable who's who of the world's largest and most glamorous passenger ships. From the Cunard darlings Mauritania and Lusitania at Pier 54, to the later magnificent Queen Mary and Elizabeth at Pier 90, the spectacular Normandy of the French line at Pier 88, and the record-breaking SS United States at 86. The ships that frequented these piers were celebrities in their own right, and they helped the piers earn their very apt nickname, beginning in the 1930s, Luxury Liner Row. In the post-Depression era, Luxury Liner Row was home to a near constant flurry of activity, as passengers of all kinds made their way to and from these grandiose vessels, with transatlantic services offered multiple times per week across several fleets of ships. These ships were capable of whisking travellers across the ocean in around 4.5 days, with the Speed Queen, SS United States, offering a trip across the Atlantic in a ripping 3.5. Most passengers look forward to their voyages, which in many ways were like holidays all of their own. Travel by sea had come leaps and bounds since the days of rickety and dangerous packet sailing ships, and in just a few short decades, luxury liners had evolved and transformed, making once dreaded sea travel a stylish and savvy way to cross the Atlantic. The steam engine meant big ships could propel themselves over the world's oceans at previously unthought of speed and regularity. Sailing ships had been doomed to sail only when the weather permitted, but steamships didn't have to worry about that, they could just forge ahead. The humble, fare-paying passenger could look forward to a relatively easy few days at sea, where every need was met, and then some. For the wealthy, it meant travelling in luxury that rivaled their favourite hotels ashore, like the Ritz and the Savoy. For the poor, it meant amenities and comforts few had ever seen before at all, like flushing toilets, electric lights, and 3 square meals a day. It wasn't just a matter of convenience either. Crafting the world's largest and fastest ships was a matter of national pride for their home countries, and celebrities and society's elite were all known to have their preferred ships, their favourite staterooms, and even captains, making a crossing on a luxury liner into a star-studded event. It wasn't just the transatlantic crossings either. Passengers could get all the way from England or America to Australia, New Zealand, or the Far East on a single ship on a single voyage. It'd take weeks, but it would be a comfortable and enjoyable escape, especially for those who weren't seasick. The ocean liner had enjoyed an unrivaled dominance of the world's ocean highways. It hadn't always been smooth sailing though, some tough lessons had to be learned along the way. There had even been attempted interlopers when Zeppelins had briefly offered trans-ocean services, but that had eventually ended in disaster, and it wasn't pursued further. Ocean liners were the undisputed monarchs of the ocean. But then, in 1957, just south of Seattle, Washington, something momentous happened that would change the world forever. To understand this, we need to wind the clock back. Throughout the 1920s, while travel by steamship was just beginning to reach the heights of absolute glitz and glamour, aviation was still well in its infancy. Travellers around the world were becoming more and more curious about air travel, and buzz began to circulate as this seemingly futuristic bit of engineering started to gain widespread notoriety. But much like ocean travel in the 1800s, aviation at the time still left much to be desired. While they had come a long way since the days of the Wright brothers, helped along massively by the huge technological advancements gleaned in the First World War, early passenger airplanes were cramped, cold, noisy, slow, and dangerous. Many aircraft could only seat around 20 passengers at a time, versus the 1,000 or more that could travel at once on board an ocean liner, and the unpressurized and unheated cabins made flying a frigid affair, especially at higher altitudes. Passengers bundled up in hats and coats to combat the freezing air with almost nothing in the way of insulation to fend off the bitter temperatures outside. Frequent refueling stops extended already sluggish flight times. Passenger aircraft were also slow. Most could only muster around 100 miles an hour. Still much quicker than a ship, but then they needed to stop every few hundred miles to refuel. During the peak years of the ocean liner, travel by air was still prohibitively expensive too, with some trips costing about half as much as a brand new car. This meant that in its early years, flying remained reserved for only the most wealthy or daring of society, and daring they needed to be. Early aviation's safety record would give any traveller pause for thought. In the late 1920s, the accident rate was 1 aircraft lost for every million miles flown. Now at the same rate, in today's world, that would equal around 7,000 fatal plane crashes annually. Navigational instruments were simple. Aircraft engines were relatively underpowered. They were completely at the mercy of the sky and its temper, and many simply disappeared. The aircraft showed promise, and the number of passenger flights slowly grew, but they couldn't yet hope to match the comfort and the luxury of the world's beloved palaces at sea. And by the year 1926, only 6,000 souls were brave enough to take to the air in these primitive commercial aircraft. Clearly, there was much progress left to be made if travel by air could ever hope to rival travel by sea. And the ocean liner enjoyed an easy lead because big ships could benefit from centuries of lessons learnt at sea, while the airplane was really breaking new ground. The 1930s saw some truly revolutionary aircraft begin to turn the tide though. The Boeing 314 Clipper, a flying boat aptly named after the great fast-sailing clipper ships of old, did something once thought only as science fiction when it carried passengers and mail across the Atlantic in 1939. Only a dozen were ever built, and the route took nearly 30 hours with multiple refueling stops, but for the 40 or so passengers it was the quickest way yet to cross the Atlantic. This was the sign of things to come, but then the world erupted into a global conflict and the transatlantic passenger service, both above and on the water, was rudely halted for 6 years. This was the crucial moment the airplane had needed to get ahead. Because while the construction and development of ocean liners had virtually stopped overnight in late 1939, the development of aircraft engines and technology was absolutely paramount. Many things came out of the Second World War that changed the airplane and travel forever. The first was the jet engine. The development of fighter aircraft like the Messerschmitt 262, the Gloucester Meteor and the Lockheed P-80 proved the jet engine as a supremely powerful propulsion system, something that could propel aircraft up to incredible speeds. But arguably the most important development, for passenger comfort especially, was cabin pressurization. In 1940, the Boeing Stratoliner had introduced the system that enabled passengers to breathe and live comfortably at much higher altitudes. The system was perfected in the B-29 bomber. Now the airplane could fly incredibly high up, over the bad weather which had once tormented it. 1952 would prove to be a critical year for the ocean liner. It had benefited from wartime lessons too, and the SS United States was designed and built in the post-war world with technology that had been seen on modern American battleships. Superheated boilers and advanced propeller designs saw the new ship snatch the speed record from the old Queen Mary in July that year and bring the transatlantic crossing down to just 3 days and 10 hours, an incredible feat. This was the fastest an ocean liner had ever been, but it was also the fastest an ocean liner would ever be, because although the United States designers didn't know it yet, even as they were preparing their ship for its triumphant maiden voyage, another vessel's first trip was underway, but this one was above the clouds. Introduced as the world's first commercial jet airliner by Britain's BOAC, the de Havilland Comet shook the world's merchant marines to their core. While its predecessors had been sluggish, cold, and uncomfortable, the Comet promised a new era in air travel with its quiet, pressurized cabin, expanded passenger capacity, and unprecedented fuel efficiency, range, and speed, all thanks to its advanced jet engines. What was once a nightmarish mode of travel now seemed positively cushy by comparison, and that's to say nothing of that speed. Suddenly, a crossing which once took days could now feasibly be undertaken in just hours. Ship owners were initially nervous, but they may have been somewhat heartened by a series of crashes which shook public confidence in the Comet. By the mid-50s, though, the kinks had been ironed out of the Comet and the playing field had been levelled. It was a showdown. Ocean liners against airliners. At first, Cunard and the great shipping lines thought they could weather the storm. Passenger numbers stayed steady in the early and mid-1950s and things looked good. But then, as the decade wore on, something changed. The series of Comet hull losses in the early 1950s, 2 of them fatal, had forced the company back to the drawing board to address severe issues with the pressurization of its cabins. These overhauls in the design of the aircraft would ultimately result in the Comet 4, in which designers applied all the lessons they had learned from their early efforts to create something that would go on to revolutionise the world of aviation. On October 4th, 1958, the Comet 4 became the first jet airliner to complete a commercial transatlantic flight. Not just one, but 2 aircraft undertaking the journey simultaneously, one bound for New York and the other for London. The westbound plane touched down after just over 10 hours, including a single brief stop in Gander, Newfoundland to refuel. The eastbound flight completed its journey in just 6 hours. The new jetliners were proving to be to the ocean liner what the ocean liner had once been to the sailing ship. Even if it seemed a losing battle, it was still a battle. The great passenger lines tried to stem the falling passenger fares. Cunard especially, with a dozen liners still in service, hoped to sway customers away from this new and speedy mode of transport, with one director quoted as saying, "Flying is a fad, it will pass." Cunard was still operating 2 of the world's most popular passenger ships, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, with 10 other ships accompanying them in the fleet. But they were hard-pressed to convince the public to opt for a 6-day crossing when a 9-hour flight was now entirely within reach. In October 1958, passenger numbers for airlines eclipsed those of shipping lines for the first time, with 1.5 million travellers crossing by air versus a comparatively pitiful 882,000 by sea. It was just a sign of things to come, because that same year, 1958, delivered a death blow to the ocean liner with the introduction of a real world beater, an aircraft that would bring air travel to the masses. The year prior, it had taken its first flight just south of Seattle, Washington. It was the Boeing 707. This was the aircraft which would define the jet age, with a 600-mile-an-hour service speed, capacity for 181 passengers, compared to the Comet's 70 or so, and an overall safer service record. The Boeing 707 completed its own crossing from New York to Paris on October 26, 1958, in a total of 8 hours and 40 minutes, including the refueling stop in Gander. It would have taken a liner days to cover the same distance. There could be no more denying it. The jet age was well and truly here. This was truly a nightmare scenario for the world's ocean liners and the companies that owned them. Almost overnight, what had once been considered the foremost option for travel was now functionally dead. Nowhere was this more evident than the once glittering New York-Chelsea piers. By 1960, the once lively piers were already beginning to fall into disrepair, and where they had at one time been the home to the hustle and bustle of merry travellers and the luxurious liners they sailed on, Now the piers were mainly relegated to handling cargo ships. But even this era was short-lived, and the last of the cargo ships had left the piers by 1967. It was a sorry sight. The piers fell into disrepair and abandonment, an ugly stain on the Hudson River front. Airports had taken their place, becoming the epicenter of the bustling travel world. Dramatically impacted by this shift was the United States line, who throughout the 1950s had enjoyed nearly unprecedented success with their record-breaking superliner, the SS United States. The United States was the largest ocean liner ever built by the Americans, and the fastest liner ever too. But even she was no match for the Boeing 707, which was capable of cracking the equivalent of a staggering 521 knots to her 38. It was a fight that the shipping world was sure to lose. While a running mate for the SS United States had been planned, Congress could no longer justify putting millions of dollars behind what was, by all accounts, a dying industry. Funding was withheld, and the SS United States successor would never materialise. In 1961, the United States had to cancel a crossing because only 350 passengers had booked. A series of strikes in 1965 saw all of the ship's summer voyages cancelled. She was permanently pulled from service just 4 years later. The SS United States had been a technological triumph, but she only saw service for 17 years, and even then, nearly 8 of those had been a struggle just for survival. While the rest of the shipping world could do little more than balk at the disastrous cards they'd been dealt, the ever-industrious Cunard line decided to operate under the old adage, if you can't beat them, join them. In fact, a few decades prior to the aviation boom, Cunard experimented with the world of air travel. This was still well before the dawn of the jet airliner back in 1937. Sir Percy Bates, then chairman of the company, was approached by Imperial Airways, who came in with a very tempting pitch. They offered Cunard a partnership and a venture into the world of flying boats, not unlike the Boeing Clipper, to supplement their fleet of liners. Bates had his doubts. Put simply, with the world still relying heavily on sea travel, and the Great Depression putting a damper on much of the travel industry's innovation, he failed to see what the company could stand to gain by expanding from sea to air. But nearly 10 years later, in 1946, Bates' successor, Sir John Brocklebank, seemed to be a more forward-thinking sort, and he was willing to revisit the idea. Brocklebank's plan included an in-house airline to add to the company's fleet, bolstering their position in the ever-changing travel world. In 1960, with airlines now exerting their dominance more and more, Cunard inked a deal with Eagle Airways to purchase a 60% share in their company. This £30 million investment would lead to the introduction of Cunard Eagle Airways, and with the acquisition, the company hoped to cement themselves as a lasting presence in the travel industry despite declining numbers in their ocean-going fleet. It seemed a natural response for the company in the face of dwindling ocean travel, and the very next year, in 1961, Cunard Eagle was operating daily transatlantic flights to accompany its continuing transoceanic schedule. This seemed to do the trick. Eventually, Cunard Eagle was operating flights to destinations all around the world. In 1962, the venture caught the attention of BOAC, who in turn offered Cunard a 30% stake in their own company. Cunard Eagle became BOAC Cunard. Eagle Airways pulled out of their side of the agreement a year later, but with tidy profits in 1964, BOAC and Cunard both held on with high hopes for a successful partnership in the long run. The unfortunate truth was that while partner BOAC had both feet firmly in the aviation business, Cunard was still operating a fleet of ships, and a pricey one at that. Meanwhile, aircraft was still evolving, and with the powerful Boeing 747 on the horizon, the company knew they lacked the capital to continue to finance both seagoing and airborne vessels, each becoming pricier with every new iteration. By the late 1960s, despite decades of attempts to position themselves as a travel juggernaut on both sea and air, reality had finally set in, and the overextended Cunard admitted defeat. BOAC Cunard officially dissolved in 1966. This was the last time a passenger shipping company would seriously attempt to toy with the world of commercial aviation. Cunard's chairman at the time, Basil Smallpiece, underlined the company's position by saying Cunard is a shipping company, and it will prosper in the long term by making its shipping operations profitable. It seemed the move was ultimately the right one. The company returned to its roots and reinvested the capital earned by the sale of its stake in BOAC, using the profits to begin the construction of a large, luxurious passenger vessel that would symbolise the next generation of Cunard's fleet, the Queen Elizabeth II. Even with the Oceanliner dying out, QE2, as she would one day be affectionately nicknamed, was designed to maintain a liner's transatlantic service, but she could also run cruises thanks to her clever layout. She was a new ship for a new era. If passenger ship companies were to survive at all, they would have to look to the growing leisure cruise market instead. Other shipping lines found their own ways to try to stay afloat in the face of airborne adversity. Travel on the Atlantic was not the only business impacted by the widespread introduction of jetliners, and in 1960 P&O lines shored up their own defences against the burgeoning air travel threat by merging with their old rivals Orient to create P&O Orient. This move allowed the company to drastically increase its footprint in the Pacific, culminating in a service that spanned 44 countries across a staggering 366 ships. This made P&O Orient the largest ocean-going passenger fleet in the world, and they'd continued to see a surprising amount of success. One factor that helped them defy the odds was the Australian immigration boom starting in 1945. These were the years of the £10 POM scheme, as it was known, the post-war push by the Australian government to urge British citizens to migrate to Australia for the low rate of just £10. Many of these immigrants made their voyages on one of the P&O Orient fleet, my own family among them in 1959, and by the time the initiative wrapped up in 1972, over 1 million people had immigrated to Australia through the program. It served to bolster Australia's population numbers and P&O's traffic, and led the company to make a crucial addition to their fleet. While it may have made sense to play it safe in the face of the bleak outlook, P&O instead decided to up the ante, and in 1961 they introduced their newest liner, the SS Canberra, which upon her completion clocked in at 45,733 gross registered tons, making her the largest liner yet built for any route outside of the transatlantic service. It was clear that P&O intended to keep both feet firmly in the shipping business and fight fire with fire, and for the most part, it paid off for them, even in the face of languishing worldwide passenger numbers. But all of these efforts combined was still a lifeline at best, and even the largest fleet in the world was not immune to the overwhelming shifts brought on by air travel. With the £10 POM scheme at its end and passenger numbers continuing to nosedive, by the mid-70s P&O had scrapped virtually all of its great pre- and post-war liners and moved away to cargo and cruises instead. Interestingly, while many companies were desperately trying to expand away from shipping to stay alive, some clever business owners were doing just the opposite, and they were finding success. Chandris Lines was founded in 1960, just 2 years after the Comet's first successful commercial transatlantic flight. Much like P&O, the aim of the Chandris line was to capitalise on the still profitable immigration trade to Australia. Their MO was simple: buy retired ocean liners at minimum cost and work them hard for maximum profit. They did this well, and their ships Australis, Ellinis, Britannis, and Patrice became well-known migrant vessels carrying thousands for new lives down under. The 3-week voyage was far from luxurious, and the ships had definitely seen better days. But the business strategy worked, and even as aircraft dominated many major routes, Chandris Line's ships sailed well booked with passengers even into the late 1970s. It was the late 60s that saw the real end of the era of the ocean liner. Cunard's trusty flagship, the RMS Queen Mary, and her running mate, Queen Elizabeth, still operated on their usual transatlantic run well into the 60s, but as you'd expect, demand was dwindling. Oftentimes, the ships would reach port with fewer passengers aboard than crew. By 1965, the transatlantic service, which once had been the company's bread and butter, was no longer profitable, and the entire fleet was operating at a loss. Both queens were sold off, the Mary to the port of Long Beach, and the Elizabeth to a Hong Kong-based businessman who hoped to convert her into a floating university. The retirement of the queens heralded the real end of an era. The ocean liner had finally died. But adaptable companies like P&O, Chandris, and even Cunard began to sense a new opportunity to keep some of their fleet in service. Cruising was actually nothing new at the time. In fact, the world's first purpose-built cruise ship had been the Hamburg America Line's Prinzessin Victoria Louise all the way back in 1900. The 1960s, though, had seen a huge uptick in demand for leisure cruises, even as demand for travel by air was reaching new heights, and cruising offered an experience that airlines couldn't hope to match. A leisurely holiday at sea where one could while away the hours with any number of activities offered on board, all with the freedom to move around the vessel instead of being restricted to one single seat in the cabin of an aircraft. While airlines offered an efficient mode of travel, cruisers offered an actual enjoyable experience, and it was this very experience that kept the world's ships at sea, even in the face of an industry which threatened to make them obsolete. Many of the remaining great ocean liners found new lives as cruise ships. Probably the most successful was the SS France. She'd been built too late to capitalise on the golden age of the ocean liner. A triumph for her home nation though she was, France was introduced just a few years after the first commercial flight of the de Havilland Comet. She saw only 14 years of service with French Line, and that should have been the end. Except a new and budding cruise line had other plans for her. Norwegian Cruise Line picked France up and transformed her into the SS Norway. What had begun life as a transatlantic passenger liner, designed to operate a schedule as ruthlessly and efficiently as a train, ended her days as a beloved cruise ship running pleasure voyages around the world. The transition to cruising wasn't easy on all ocean liners, and some just couldn't cut it. The Italian liners Cristoforo Colombo and Leonardo da Vinci were just too expensive to run. They'd been built to absolutely burn through monstrous amounts of fuel to run at breakneck transatlantic speeds, not swanning around on joy cruises. Not only that, but their class-segregated interiors became a confusing maze once the ship was converted to one-class cruising, with staircases that skipped decks and corridors that seemed to go nowhere. By contrast, other ships had been designed with this future in mind. The Dutch SS Rotterdam used a genius system of folding panels that could separate classes during a crossing, or be folded down to open the ship up for one-class cruising. She had a long and successful career with her original owners and beyond into the 21st century. The first half of the 20th century saw the ocean liner at its absolute peak. The world was connected like never before, and passengers could be carried across entire oceans in record times and in unmatched comfort. Countries took pride in producing the biggest and the best vessels the world had ever seen, consistently outclassing one another in terms of size, speed, strength, luxury, and efficiency. But as history has shown us time and time again, technology is constantly finding new ways to change and evolve, so it was little wonder that the ocean liner's days were numbered. Looking back at the success of the SS United States and the blue ribbon holders who came before her, one fundamental truth rings clear. In the eyes of a fickle travelling public, speed comes above everything else. It seems obvious then that for all its wonders, this stately and beautiful mode of travel was bound to be eclipsed by the miracle of flight, and by 1958 that was exactly what had happened. Despite the best efforts of the most illustrious shipping lines of the time, travellers were largely ready to move on from the ocean liner and on to the next big thing. They simply voted with their wallets. The results were disastrous for an entire industry and way of life. The Chelsea piers, once the glorious site of Ocean Liner Row, fell into disrepair in the 60s, rotted in the 70s, and then completely collapsed in the 80s before they were fully dismantled. Today, the waterfront has been rejuvenated with parks, bars, and luxury hotels, and only the facade of Cunard's Pier 54 remains of the massive original structure. At the other end of the route, in Southampton, the magnificent custom-built Ocean Terminal building, designed specifically for the big mail ships like Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, had worked as a kind of lounge and baggage handling facility with a massive train station so passengers could easily step foot from off of their train and onto their ship. It was finished in the 50s, but scrapped in the 80s, already a relic of a bygone era. But within a decade, the cruise industry had exploded, and Southampton once again found itself needing exactly the kind of ocean terminal building it had demolished. Today, if you want to board a cruise ship from the port, you won't do so from a beautiful deco building, but from a series of Spartan sheds instead. Such is the march of progress. Of the ocean-going greats that had once won the hearts of millions, few remain today. The Queen Mary has been preserved as a museum and a hotel in Long Beach, California, but Queen Elizabeth caught fire and burnt to a crisp in the 60s before her university overhaul ever bore any fruit. The Rotterdam has been remarkably well restored and now acts as a museum and a hotel in the port of her name in the Netherlands. France served for years as the cruise ship Norway, the sweetheart of tens of thousands of passengers, before being finally scrapped in 2006. United States, the brilliant record-breaking speed demon, has sat rotting for years at a dock in Philadelphia, and now, instead of being preserved for future generations, it looks like she's going to be sunk to become an artificial reef. There is just one glorious ship at sea upholding the old traditions, Cunard's Queen Mary II, a remarkable, special ship built in the early 2000s. She was designed to fulfill the role her forebears had done so well before her. With 40% more steel than your standard cruise ship at much greater construction expense, the Queen Mary 2 can take the worst the Atlantic can throw at her. Once, recently, in a terrific storm, most Atlantic traffic was stopped in its tracks, including ships of the Navy, who were bemused to spot, on their radar screens, one vessel making good headway into the huge seas. "What are you?" they radioed out. The reply was simple and concise. "The Queen Mary," they said. Imagine this. You've had to abandon your ship, loaded heavily with aviation fuel, after it was set on fire in an attack. You and your comrades took to the ocean in 2 lifeboats, but in the chop and the darkness, you've been separated. Now your boat drifts aimlessly, and a full day later, as a storm is just beginning to blow, a light is spotted off on the horizon. You pull with all your might on the oars, and you even rig a sail, hoping for rescue, and you find, to your absolute surprise, that the light is actually a ship on fire. It's the ship you abandoned yesterday, but it's still afloat and it hasn't sunk yet. This is the exact bizarre scenario that the crew of the MV San Demetrio found themselves in late 1940. Caught out in an assault by a German pocket battleship, the vessel had an epic comeback after its men abandoned it to burn and presumably explode, only to come across the thing still burning happily the next day. What happened next is one of the great feats of maritime daring-do from the war. This is the incredible true tale of the San Demetrio, the ship that rescued its own crew. Late 1940. The war has been raging for a full year now, since Nazi Germany's Panzer IIs and IIIs rolled over the Polish border. After the phony war had come the invasion of France and Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway. Britain was on the ropes. But the Battle of Britain had shown that Germany's forces could be defeated. The island nation held out under intense nighttime raids by the Luftwaffe, while at sea, the Kriegsmarine's U-boats and warships hunted with near impunity. The strategy had been to starve Britain into submission, to deprive it of the critical materials it needed from friendly powers across the sea to keep the war machine humming. Merchant ships bunched up in convoys for protection, but the protection the Royal Navy could actually offer was often pathetic. Their most powerful ships were tied up in the Mediterranean, and even a destroyer could hardly be detached from fleet work to do something as mundane as escort duty. So merchant ships were given little 3 and 4 inch guns or QF 12 pounders and told, essentially, to hope for the best. Now, one of these convoys was HX 84. It had steamed from Halifax, bound for Liverpool, on October 28th, 1940. Made up of 38 ships, oil tankers and freighters, the convoy had originally been protected by the ancient Wicks-class destroyer Columbia and the Clemson-class St. Francis, which were both built in the last war. But alongside those ships was Jervis Bay, an ocean liner converted through the addition of guns no bigger than 6 inches and dating to the late 1800s into an armed merchant cruiser. Now, recent history had shown that ocean liners make for shocking auxiliary cruisers, but the Royal Navy was tied up, and the Admiralty was in a desperate position, so Jervis Bay and many like her were called up to pull off a task that could suddenly often turn brutal. So, HX-84 set off with Columbia and St. Francis both peeling off after a day of escort duty clearing the coast. The convoy plodded on until November 5th, when they were about 800 miles or 1,300 kilometers southeast of the tip of Greenland. In mid-Atlantic, a smudge of smoke was spotted on the horizon. Now, we've covered this story before in some detail, but you can only imagine the convoy's collective horror when the smudge materialized into the massive heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, the kind of fast miniature battleship that was ideally suited for hunting down and killing convoys. With its fast-acting 11-inch main guns at a top speed of 28 knots, there was simply no running. With a main belt of 80mm or 3 inches of steel armor, there wasn't a single gun between any of the ships on the convoy that could possibly hurt her. But still, the escort, Jervis Bay, peeled off to draw Admiral Scheer's fire in a kind of desperate self-sacrifice that many have since described as reckless, but which, in my opinion at least, served to tie the German warship down long enough for the convoy to scatter and try to escape into the dusk. Now, Jervis Bay was hit and basically taken to bits by the German gunfire, and the Scheer turned its attention to the panicked and fleeing convoy ships, One of them was a tanker absolutely loaded with aviation fuel. Now, there are certain cargoes you just don't want to be carrying if you're hit, and right at the top of that list would have to be gasoline and fuel. The tanker was a floating keg. The San Demetrio was a modern kind of tanker built back in 1938, with 8-cylinder diesels and a hull that was about 463 feet or 141 meters long, and about 8,073 gross registered tons. She wasn't a giant ship, but she was a modern and utilitarian workhorse that had been built for the Eagle Oil and Shipping Company in peacetime, but now found itself in one of the most dangerous and unforgiving battlefields in the world. On her bridge was Captain George Waite, who'd already experienced hell at sea because in late 1939 he'd been the skipper of the tanker San Alberto that was caught and torpedoed by the U-48. He now watched unappalled as Admiral Scheer sped straight past the now silent and burning Jarvis Bay and turned her guns on the convoy. It was every man for himself. The New Zealand liner Ranjitiki was hit, but she dropped a dense smoke screen that hit her well enough to make an escape. Others weren't so fortunate. German shells slammed into them, and Waite, on the San Demetrio, had to try to steer his vessel to safety. With the light failing, he hoped he might escape into the night, and he altered course to starboard to clear the main body of fleeing merchant ships. But there was a shout of alarm from a lookout because a ship to their right, off on the starboard bow, was attempting to do the opposite and seemingly steer directly into them. Fortunately, collision was just avoided. Then Waite and his men felt San Demetrio tremble underfoot because she was hit. Night had fallen, but a big moon was illuminating the horizon ahead of the German cruiser, which could easily pick its prey out of the darkness. It fired on, and the crew of the San Demetrio only being able to see flashes in the dark from far behind them. Shells rained down all around. The ship they'd narrowly avoided colliding with was hit first, and the screams of the wounded drifted across the water. Then it was San Demetrio's turn. Hit after hit, shell after shell struck home, and soon the vessel was burning fiercely. After only 1 hour since the Admiral Scheer had started the attack, San Demetrio was presumed a total loss. Burning completely out of control, she'd become a giant petrol bomb just waiting to go off at any moment. Now, this wasn't diesel fuel. It was fast-burning, high-octane aviation gas that threatened to detonate into an all-consuming, enormous fireball. Captain Waite knew the game was up, and he wasted absolutely no time at all. He ordered his ship hastily abandoned. A handful of boats were swung out and lowered, but one was swamped, leaving just the forward, starboard, and port boats bobbing together in the darkening night, one loaded with 26 men and the other with just 16. Now, briefly tethered together, a plan was formed to get away from the tanker as quickly as possible, but now they had another issue. Ships from the convoy were tearing past them from every angle in a desperate bid for escape. They were badly at risk of being run down by one of their own ships. The men rowed like demons to get out of the way, but when the danger had cleared and the night became still, the two boats had been separated and set out into the night. Most alarmingly of all, the wind was freshening and it looked like there might be a storm on the horizon. Admiral Scheer hunted and fired on vessels well into the night until she finally disengaged about midnight. 5 merchant ships were sunk outright, not including Jarvis Bay, which herself had gone down with nearly 200 lives. San Demetrio had been abandoned to burn into the night, but the rest of the convoy had scattered and would survive. Cold comfort for the men in the boats, who had to spend a night being tossed around the ocean like a cork, next morning brought a full gale with huge waves. The open-top boats were battered and thrown around, filling with water, so the men had to bail nearly non-stop just to stay afloat. Our efforts now, recalled apprentice John Jones, were just survival, as the seas swamped the boats and often we bailed for our lives. As conditions grew worse, and they were seriously at risk of sinking with no help at hand, the boat loaded with 16 men was treated to an enticing sight. A call from someone announced a dark shape off to windward, a ship, somewhere off in the distance about 4 miles away. The men shouted, lit flares, and tried to wave her down, but there was no response. A brief period of depression followed, wrote Jones, which we soon realised was a luxury we could not afford, and the fight for our lives resumed. More flooding and endless bailing. It went on and on until the afternoon, when the storm seemed to calm, and then, again, another ship could be seen, but this one was tailed by an ominous, greasy cloud of smoke. The men hoisted a sail to catch the fresh breeze and try to run the ship down for rescue, but the closer they got, the more familiar the ship appeared. It took a while, Jones recalled, to recognise that this was our own ship. San Demetrio had not exploded. Instead, it had burnt through the night and now continued to burn, but it was bearing down on the boat as if to swing past for a rescue. Faced now with the prospect of sinking at sea in their open-top boats, the men decided to try reboarding their own tanker to see what could be done. They bore down on it with sails set, but afternoon was slowly turning to evening, and with the failing light, a hard decision had to be made. Reboarding the ship in a big sea was tough enough, but to do it in the dark was insanity. The men settled in for another night in the cold in their open-top boat, but they brought their charge in behind the San Demetrio to shelter from the worst of the weather in the lee of her massive hull. After an agonising night, the dawn brought renewed hopes. Although San Demetrio drifted off about 5 miles, she still hadn't exploded. They rigged their sail once again and came up right alongside, aghast at the charred hull and twisted superstructure. Somewhere deep inside, the fire still raged and smoke was pouring into the sky. But anything would be better than staying in the boat being pummeled by the ocean. They swung themselves aboard and took stock of the situation. San Demetrio was a burnt mess. And worst of all, she was actually sinking. A shell had entered the port bow just above the waterline, explained Jones. It exploded and splinters had holed our collision bulkhead, resulting in our forehold making water, which was settling the vessel by the head. As if that wasn't bad enough, the main command and control centers of the ship had been reduced to a black, smoking mass of twisted steel. The bridge was long gone, along with all of the main crew accommodations and midships. Jones remembered that the main deck under the structure was buckled with heat from the fire, which had been so intense that the brass and glass of the portholes had melted and fused, resembling icicles. If the men had any chance of survival though, they had to make do and save their ship. They broke out fire extinguishers and buckets and tried to douse the flames that were still licking at the after accommodations bulkheads. By some miracle, the chief engineer, Charles Pollard, had been aboard the lifeboat that had stumbled across the ship, so he ventured down below and found that the main machinery in the engine room was still largely workable, but the port boiler had been put out of action. With the metalwork still glowing red hot, Pollard and a handful of men had got the boiler repaired, and they raised enough pressure to bring the ship's dynamos and pumps back to life as well. With the water pressure on the lines, fire hoses could be brought to bear. 5 hours of battling flames and smoke later, this skeleton crew had doused the blaze, and the San Demetrio, although she was still technically sinking, albeit slowly, drifted into the night with their exhausted crew slumped over their hoses. 4 cabins had been undamaged by the fire, and the men passed out into a deep slumber, which was well earned, while a watch stayed up to make sure all was well. In the night, the fire at the stern started up again, but the handful of men who were actually on watch were able to put it out before daybreak, which brought its own surprises. In the night, the weather had got worse. Now, obviously, if the men had stayed in their boat, they couldn't have survived the night at all. As if to prove the point, the lifeboat, which they had lashed to the falls, had been ripped away and lost. Scrounging around below found that, although many of the supplies had been burnt up or contaminated, the ship's stores deep in the hold still contained potatoes, onions, and condensed milk. Yummy. Then there came a small cheer when 3 bottles of rum were found, which was good news, matched only by the announcement by Chief Engineer Pollard that the ship's engines still worked and they could get their battered, charred ship underway again. It seemed incredible, but there was a chance San Demetrio and this group of shipwrecked crewmen might actually make it to safety. They made a plan. The bridge and all of its equipment had been consumed by the fire, so there was no big compass to help guide them. But if they steered using the emergency compartment at the stern and the auxiliary gear, which a crew under Pollard had just got working again, for the sunset in the west that eventually hit the US or the Canadian coast. They did consider this briefly, but their ship was likely to sink if it was subjected to too much punishment at the bow, and a westward course would drive her into the worst of it. So instead, they chose to steer for the sunrise, or eastward, and pray that they hit the Irish or the English coast instead. We navigated, wrote Jones, by rare glimpses of the sun and stars, but mainly by keeping the wind astern. The 9th November to the 12th November, we proceeded approximately eastward in a very heavy weather, the vessel labouring and becoming very sluggish. San Demetrio was not in a good way, but they'd come so far the men tried everything they could to keep her afloat. Someone came up with the clever idea of draining the forward fuel tanks to lighten the ship's bow. It wasn't an easy job because the pump room was absolutely full of gas. But the chief, Jones, and a couple of others went down to open the valves and drain the tanks off, giving their ship a starboard list, but raising her bow so that she rode the waves easier. The bad weather threatened to sink their ship and gave every man on board serious cause for concern, but also enveloped the vessel in a misty rain, and it made it difficult for prowling U-boats to spot the crippled vessel and finish her off. She was a sitting duck, but the bad weather was helping to keep her safe. Finally, on the 13th of November, land was sighted off in the distance, a wispy, dark streak that could just as easily have been occupied France as it was neutral Ireland. The men aboard had simply no idea. They made for a sheltered bay and stopped for the night to rest after their Herculean effort. Next morning came a shout as an aircraft roared overhead, which evidently reported their position because soon a tugboat and the British destroyer HMS Arrow arrived on the scene to assist. They were met with a shocking sight. The San Demetrio, charred and looking very much like a ghost ship, sat at anchor with SOS still chalked on her battered superstructure. The crew had done it, through blindly following the sun and stars that arrived off Ireland and been rescued by friendly forces. The maimed tanker got her engines running again and chugged along for the Clyde, escorted by Arrow and continuous air cover above. I doubt, said Jones, that any single merchant ship had, up to that time, enjoyed such a strong escorting force. San Demetrio, the unlikely survivor of convoy HX-84, anchored in the Clyde that night and was able to discharge her own fuel cargo using her own power and pumps, to Chief Engineer Pollard's great satisfaction. Remarkably, not only had San Demetrio survived the ordeal, she had successfully delivered her critical fuel supply, discharging 11,000 tons, only about 1,000 tons less than she'd set out with because it had burnt. Without books or instruments, charts or a compass, Jones and the others had safely navigated their ship some 1,500 kilometers or 944 miles over open ocean to safety. There was more good news yet. The other lifeboat, the one with 26 men in it, including Captain Waite, had gone off into the night, but was actually picked up and taken to safety in Newfoundland. The whole thing would have been a bloodless affair were it not for the wounding of greaser John Boyle in the evacuation. He'd been in Jones and Pollard's boat and held on best he could, but he died after 2 days. When San Demetrio was spotted off Ireland, her red duster flag was flying at half-mast out of respect for him. The men who'd brought San Demetrio in were pleased to learn that they were entitled to the salvage cut through maritime law, paid out to those able to rescue damaged or sinking ships. Pollard got £2,000 and Jones £1,200. That's about £96,000 and £58,000 in today's money respectively. So did the rest of the crew, and Boyle's family was paid his cut of £1,000 as well. Sadly, San Demetrio's fate had only been delayed. In March 1942, she was motoring off Virginia when she was sunk for good by a U-boat. The Battle of the Atlantic is legendary for its brutality. Those set adrift of the lifeboats often had no chance at survival or rescue, and many were never seen again. Were it not for the timely arrival of the burning San Demetrio, the 16 men in her lifeboat would probably have joined that number. Hundreds and hundreds of ships were sunk. Many friends of mine, wrote Jones in 1977, were lost with them. I consider myself very fortunate, he said, to have survived the war years and been able to continue with my sea career until 1971, whereas many friends hardly got the chance to begin theirs. The sacrifice of the merchant navy during the war is a powerful testament to the resilience of that unique creature known as the mariner, and the San Demetrio should forever be remembered as the ship that rescued her own crew. We've spent a lot of time on this channel talking about the Oceanliner, big passenger-carrying steamships from the mid-1800s, something that, as a piece of technology, completely changed the way the world travelled. It's actually kind of hard to convey just how big a change this was. Naturally, to demonstrate things, we need to look at what life was like before the Oceanliner. Here's a spoiler alert, it's not a pretty picture. Without exaggeration, it can be said that for hundreds and hundreds of years of our history, going to sea was like rolling a dice to see if you'd make it or not. It's that dangerous out there. It was almost like going to space. I've mentioned the lock line a few times on the channel too. They're a favourite of mine for demonstrating this exact point. Lockline was an experienced Scottish shipping firm that was set up in the 1860s and came to acquire a fleet of 25 then modern iron-hulled sailing ships that combined all the centuries of knowledge we'd learnt in operating sailing ships and the huge technological developments that metal hulls had brought. They were quick, they were well built, crewed by experienced hands. So it may come as something of a surprise to learn that Lockline ended up with a shocking track record. Lockard, Carron, Erne, Leven, Moydart, Nevis, Ryan, Shiel, Sloy, Senart, and Torridon were all wrecked. Lochfine, Lagan, Lomond, Marie, and Vinecar all simply disappeared at sea, with all hands lost, presumably from storms, collisions with icebergs, or even rogue waves. There wasn't anything inherently wrong with their ships or their crews, it's just how dangerous conditions were. And we'd all kind of accepted that this was the cost of travel. There was just no other alternative, no way of actually getting across the ocean without risking your life. Sure, some lines cut corners and ran unnecessary risks, but the truth of it is that times were just tough, and in the 1800s, so many ships were lost that it's actually hard to choose which stories best explain what those risks were like. But I've picked two, and the first one in particular is chilling. The first one happened not too far from me in Australia. She was called the Cataraqui. Cataraqui was a sailing ship, a bark, built in England in 1840. She was absolutely typical of the hundreds, if not thousands of ships of that kind that were sailing to and from Australia at the time. See, in the mid-1800s, Australia was still a relatively new British colony, and the government was keen to establish more of a foothold on the continent. Assisted immigrant schemes were put into place where families seeking to establish a new life, away from the grime and muck of England's cities, could try their luck in an entirely new continent and society. There were a few downsides though, especially the trip out. The voyage to Australia was really tough, and conditions were nothing short of awful. The ships leaked and rolled violently in the high seas, and passengers not yet used to travelling at sea were sick the entire way. The decks ran thick with vomit, and passenger quarters were cramped and dimly lit. Many sailing immigrant ships simply disappeared in storms, never to be seen again. To sail to Australia was to risk your life. Cataraqui was tiny, only 138 feet or 42 metres long, and 802 tons. But still, in April 1845, into her decks were crowded 369 immigrants and 41 crew. 120 of the hopeful immigrants were married with families, and the ship carried 73 children. In April, she set out from Liverpool, bound for what is today Melbourne, Australia. For months, the ship laboured in rolling seas and high winds, slowly making its way under Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Conditions were far from perfect, and one crewman even fell overboard and was lost. Approaching Australia, the crew were faced with a unique issue. This was well before the days of GPS navigation, radar, or anything like that. Bearings and navigational readings were taken from the sun and stars, and it took competent officers to translate the readings into a position on the ship's charts. After months without seeing land, knowing your exact position was extremely difficult. It's made even harder when the weather is rough or blowing a gale. The crew knew that they were approaching the south coast of Australia and plotted roughly where they thought they might make landfall. Meanwhile, down in the passenger quarters, the two ship's doctors, both brothers named Carpenter, had been hard at work. On the voyage, 5 children had been born, and 6 others had died. And such was life in the golden age of sail, when voyages took so long to complete. Cataraqui had left in April, but only began to near the southern coast of Australia in August. On the 3rd, the boisterous weather had grown into a full gale, and the ship was forced to heave to, riding the storm out, not making any progress forward until it had passed. The passengers inside must have been tossed around and frightened witless by the pounding seas and rolling ship, but Cataraqui was designed to survive exactly this kind of treatment. But there was an issue. Conditions had been so bad that Captain C.W. Finlay had not been able to take a navigational reading for 4 days. And the ship was being battered around like a cork in a storm, and they had no idea where the shore was. And to hit it would spell absolute disaster. With seas running mountain high and the wind blowing a gale, the ship groped around in the darkness until about 4 a.m. on the morning of August 4th, when there was a terrible crash. Cataraqui had hit a reef off the shore of King Island on the approach to Port Phillip Bay. The captain and crew of Cataraqui had navigated without sighting land for weeks, if not months, to the exact point of making landfall and arriving successfully. They were only one day out of their destination, but instead of being able to sight land, they now ran afoul of jagged, razor-sharp rocks, and the ship ground hard, driven into the reef by the thunderous oceans. The hull immediately began to flood, and the passengers panicked. And what unfolded next almost defies description and is best told by one of the few survivors, the ship's chief mate, Guthrie. The scene of confusion and misery that ensued at this awful period, it is almost impossible to describe. All the passengers attempted to rush on deck, and many succeeded in doing so until the ladders were knocked away by the workings of the vessel, when the shrieks from men, women and children from below were terrific, calling on the watch on deck to assist them. The crew were actually mostly up on deck at the time of the collision and immediately got to work. Because the ladders leading up and out of the passenger quarters onto the deck were knocked away, the crew began to tie ropes and haul passengers out bodily, one by one. It was a mammoth effort, but in the end they got a few hundred up on deck. But escaping the flooding hull was one thing. The upper decks offered no shelter from the raging sea. Waves broke over the ship and swept passengers away in their dozens. At 5 a.m, just an hour after the grounding, the ship rolled totally onto her port side, huge waves roaring down the ship's deck and washing away the lifeboats, spars, and even part of the ship's superstructure. The captain, crew, and any remaining passengers held on for dear life, and Captain Finlayson ordered that the masts should be cut away to try to right the vessel. Somehow the crew managed to do it. The masts were all cut off, but despite this heroic effort, the Cataraqui was stuck fast on its side. Passengers caught below in the hull drowned when the ship inevitably filled totally with water. A few hundred people now clung desperately to the side of the ship, exposed totally to the storm. Now, all they could do was try to wait to outlast it. Chief Mate Guthrie recalled, "As the day broke, we found the stern of the vessel washed in, numerous dead bodies floating around the ship, some banging up on the rocks. Several of the passengers and crew, about 200 altogether, were still holding onto the vessel, the sea breaking over and every wave washing some of them away." Incredibly, they clung on from 5 a.m, when Cataraqui rolled, to 4 in the afternoon, with no hope of escape. To jump into the water would mean almost certain death because the seas were so high that you'd be ground hard into the rocks. Then, in the late afternoon, something horrifying began to happen. Cataraqui had been subjected to unbelievable stresses, withstanding the full force of thunderous ocean waves for hours. With a groan and a crack, the ship began to give way, and then she split in two. Immediately, around 100 survivors were thrown into the waves, and anybody left holding on huddled around on the remaining section of the ship. With the ocean surging around them, they attempted to fashion a buoy to float out to the shoreline, but it became tangled, and it broke up in the seas. Then the ship began to break up beneath their feet, even more, flinging more into the ocean until there was just one section of the ship's bow or front left poking out above the waves, with just 70 people left holding on. Unbelievably, this group clung onto the ship until daybreak the next morning, but when the sun rose, only 30 were left. A party, including one of the Dr. Carpenter brothers, attempted to set off in the only remaining lifeboat, but it was immediately capsized and they were all lost. Then the bow section began to break up, and Cataraqui was finished. With only 20 left holding on for dear life, whatever ropes they'd fashioned to hold them to the wreck were undone to give them a final chance at life. Chief Mate Guthrie grabbed a plank of wood and plunged into the raging ocean. The plank helped carry him over the worst of the rocks, and he was somehow washed up alive on shore. He found another man, a passenger, who'd also miraculously survived, and then a smaller group of frightened, shivering crew. The survivors were tended to by a resident of the island who'd seen chunks of ship floating by and figured there had been a wreck. In the end, the survivors were stranded on the island for 5 weeks while the storm abated and a rescue could be organised. In total, 9 men, 8 crew and 1 passenger survived out of a total complement of 423 souls, and not a single woman or child made it. At the very moment Cataraqui was breaking up on the rocks, on the other side of the world, a different ship was being built. SS Birkenhead was a Mersey-built steamer launched just 2 months after Cataraqui was lost. In late February 1852, she was steaming nicely through the calm waters off Western Cape, South Africa. The sea was still, the conditions clear, basically perfect weather for any ship's crew. On board the ship were about 640 men, women and children, including around 500 British soldiers, drawn from 10 different regiments on their way to a remote colonial conflict. With little wind to fill their sails, most British ships of the time might have been in trouble, but not Birkenhead, because she had been the latest thing in technology. She was laid down in 1845 at the famous John Laird shipyard in England. Unlike Cataraqui, Birkenhead's primary method of propulsion was a pair of 564 horsepower steam engines that drove paddles on either side of the ship's hull. The ship was heavily laden down, with hundreds of passengers and crew and tons of stores and provisions packed into the hold. The 210-foot, 64-metre ship displaced around 2,000 tons. She'd originally been designed as a warship, a frigate, to be armed with old-fashioned cannons, but by this point ships had started to be built with iron hulls. Birkenhead was one of them. Now this was a strange era in ship design when some vessels used the latest technology and were simply too far ahead of their time. It was decided that Birkenhead would have more use as a troop ship because, at the time, Britain's empire was vast and spanned tens of thousands of miles. Birkenhead was called up to take troops from 10 different regiments, departing first from Portsmouth, where then she would steam for Queenstown near Cove, Ireland, then swing down for the Cape. Birkenhead would need to deposit many of the passengers and soldiers near Cape Town before then steaming on to deposit the rest of the reinforcements at Algoa Bay in Eastern Cape. Birkenhead set off and the trip was expected to take about a month. The ship was commanded by Captain Robert Salmond, a stern Scotsman of the Royal Navy, about whom relatively little is known. Aboard his ship were about 500 soldiers of regiments like the 2nd Queen's Surreys, the 12th Lancers, the 60th King's Royal Rifle Corps, even the 73rd Foot Regiment, now better known as the Black Watch, under the watchful eye of 2 senior officers, Captain Edward Wright and Major Alexander Seaton. Seaton had never been on campaign, but Wright was a veteran. Birkenhead's voyage was marked almost from the start as a doomed venture when she was steaming straight into a terrifying gale which battered the ship and threatened to sink her. Fortunately, her paddles meant the ship could keep her bow pointed into the worst of the weather, and for the better part of 2 full weeks, Birkenhead battled the elements. When at last the storm cleared, it was obvious that the soldiers, many of whom had never even seen the sea, were effectively physically defeated by their brush with the ocean's might. You can only imagine the hellish conditions down below in the ship's dormitories, but still, Birkenhead chugged along bound for Africa. After more than a month of steaming, Birkenhead arrived on February 23rd at Simon's Bay near Cape Town. Many soldiers who were too ill had to be disembarked along with most of the women and children aboard. But little did they know that even though Birkenhead's ultimate destination at Algoa Bay was only a few days away, their leaving the ship would probably save their lives. With 640 still aboard, Birkenhead had resupplied and at last set out for Algoa Bay. Captain Salmond, likely frustrated by the delay caused by the huge storm, decided to maintain a course that hugged the coast, which would, in theory, get his ship to her destination sooner. Late at night, shortly before 2 a.m, the ship's leadsman took a depth reading which revealed 12 fathoms, 22 metres or 72 feet of water, beneath the ship. Now Birkenhead had something of a curious quirk. She'd actually been designed and built by a very capable shipbuilder, but government interference had dashed their original plans. Originally, Birkenhead would have sat quite evenly in the water with a draft of about 15 feet, 9 inches or just under 5 metres, but the Admiralty had suggested that the shaft of the paddle wheels be moved further forward. Now this small change upset Birkenhead's trim and meant that she was actually quite bow heavy. It's not entirely certain if this impacted what happened to the Birkenhead that night, or if Salmond had just adjusted for this issue by loading his ship heavier further aft to ease the trim. But regardless, just after the leadsman took his depth reading, there was a sickening, grinding crunch as Birkenhead's heavy bow was ripped and torn by something in the water. Seemingly out of nowhere, an uncharted rock had torn into the ship's hull. The depth under keel had suddenly jumped from 22 metres, 72 feet, to just 2 fathoms, 3.7 metres, or only 12 feet beneath the bow. Because of her unusual trim, Birkenhead was likely down by the head. You wonder, if she'd been correctly trimmed, she might have just cleared the rocks by steaming over the top of it. That wasn't the only condition working against Birkenhead that night. The unusually calm weather meant there were no waves breaking on the base of the rock, or, if it was submerged by the tide, no telltale disturbed white water over the top of the shoal. Salmond, half-dressed, raced on deck and ordered the anchor deployed and the engines run astern to try to free his ship, but this move proved fatal. The best thing he could have done in a situation like that is probably to keep the ship grounded firmly on the rocks to prevent it from sinking in deeper water. But as Birkenhead worked herself free, the rocks tore even more of the hull open. For those on deck, it would have been evidenced by a grinding sensation underfoot, but down in the hull, it was very different. Men, soundly asleep, were awakened as thousands and thousands of gallons of water suddenly roared into their dormitories, and over 100 are estimated to have drowned where they slept. Birkenhead's iron hull had been cleverly divided into 8 watertight compartments, but the rocks tearing at the hull had opened almost all of them up to the ocean, and those that were originally watertight had been cut open to allow men to move more freely throughout the ship. It meant Birkenhead suddenly started to sink very quickly. With only a few meagre quarter boats available, it was clear there could be no hope of evacuating any significant portion of the ship's complement. In the bow, dozens of men quickly rushed to man the ship's pumps, discharging floodwater over the side. Clearly, it was a lost cause, but at least it would keep the ship afloat long enough to hopefully get some of the boats away. They were uncovered and rigged to the simple davits to be swung over the ship's side. Salmond ordered one of the marine drummers to beat to quarters, and slowly the soldiers, as well as the ship's own marines, gathered on deck. Paintings would go on to show them standing to attention in their immaculate red coats, but the truth was that most of them were barely dressed or wrapped in blankets because they'd been so hastily called out from down below. The ship's captain found Major Seaton and calmly asked if he would, quote, be kind enough to preserve order and silence among the men. With about 60 men at the pumps and 60 others working to free the lifeboats, the remainder were ordered to stand in rank at the stern with the hope that the bow would be raised somewhat by their weight. Lieutenant Colonel Seaton walked up and down the ranks. Even though he was an academic officer and had never seen combat, he knew that he had to keep his men in check. With a firm voice, he asked them to stay in place, and they dutifully followed his commands. In fact, there wasn't any noise save for the men toiling at the boats and the horses stamping their feet. This is when Salmond made history. As the soldiers stood unmoved on the ship's decks, now ominously tilting down by the head, the captain ordered the women and children into the boats. He was adamant there could be no panic, and the troops would not break file or rush the lifeboats. To their credit, the men simply stood and watched as the chaos began to unfold around them. Captain Salmond's plan had been for his ship to float free of the rock, and then either remain afloat long enough for help to arrive, or for the ship to be beached. The quarter boats were lowered over the side, and then loading got underway. First, one of the ship's cutters with about 7 women and 9 children. The boat was filled with other officers and men and set out, so too did the next cutter and the ship's gig. In all, about 62 soldiers and 3 marines boarded the boats along with a young officer and the ship's surgeon. Salmond then had the men frantically set to work on the boats kept atop the paddle box. They would be able to get more away to safety yet. But then, with the evacuation efforts properly underway and the men tearing at the paddle box boat tackles, the unthinkable happened. With their engines still running astern, 10 minutes after the original impact, Birkenhead impacted the bottom again, but this time it would prove fatal. The engine room was torn open and tons of water rushed in, dousing the boilers. The ship lurched heavily, but the soldiers still stood in their ranks. It was clear that she was doomed, and then the end came incredibly quickly. The hull was subjected to enormous forces. With a roar, the bow section, with dozens of men still inside trying to work the pumps, broke free from the stern, disintegrated and sank almost immediately. The decapitated ship lurched underfoot and threw many of the soldiers to the deck. Over their heads, the ship's tall funnel came down right on top of the starboard paddle box where the men were working to free the boats there. They were killed and the paddle box itself carried away by the wreckage. Captain Salmond knew the end had come, and he called out, "Save yourselves, all those who can swim, jump overboard and make for the boats. This is your only hope of salvation." But Seaton, overseeing his men, knew that a break in ranks would probably end in disaster. Even as Birkenhead's decks began to be swallowed by the ocean, he shouted, "The cutter with the women and children will be swamped. I implore you not to do this thing, and I ask you to stand fast." Amazingly, the men listened, and only 3 broke their ranks. This display of discipline can only have come from the years of harsh drill and military training that taught men to stand firm in the face of cavalry attacks or volleys of gunfire and canister shot. But it must have been more than that. These hundreds of men were now faced with almost certain death, but they barely moved, even as the water swirled wide around their feet. A survivor, Captain Edward Wright of the 91st, wrote, "The order and regularity that prevailed on board from the time the ship struck until she totally disappeared far exceeded anything that I thought could be affected by the best discipline. And it is the more to be wondered at, seeing that most of the soldiers were but a short time in the service. Everyone did as he was directed, and there was not a murmur or cry amongst them until the ship made her final plunge. I could not name any individual officer who did more than any other. All received their orders and had them carried out as if the men were embarking instead of going to the bottom. There was only this difference, that I never saw any embarkation conducted with so little noise or confusion. Attempts at lowering one of the other paddle box boats, probably on the port side, failed when a line gave way and it tumbled into the sea. Finally, about 20 minutes after the initial impact, the end came for Birkenhead. The stern section dropped, the men were gradually swallowed up by the boiling waters, and Seaton's last cry was "God bless you all." He was never seen again. It was over 2 miles, or about 3.3 kilometres to shore, and most of those men had no experience with water whatsoever. It was only then, once they were in the water, that the panic came, and shouts and screams echoed in the night. But almost as soon as Birkenhead disappeared beneath the waves, an eerie silence once again fell over the scene. Those who couldn't swim were drowned, but many banded together to attempt the Herculean 2-mile swim to shore. They never tried to swarm the lifeboats. Amazingly, dozens of men actually made it and landed, exhausted, on the shore, having had to battle their way in the final short stretch through thick seaweed that pulled many down. Around 50 reached landfall, but around them as they had swum, dozens more of their comrades and friends met their end thanks to sharks. They came out in their dozens and attacked the men in the water. The ship's boats banded together through the night and then, the next day, attempted their own landings on the rocky shoreline. Sadly, had more senior officers survived in the boats, a nighttime landing could have been possible, and more in the water might have been saved, ferried to and from the shore throughout the night. But as it was, the early morning daylight revealed a scene of carnage and chaos. Bodies and wreckage floated in the waves. At the shore, the men who had successfully landed recovered other pieces of the ship which men had tied themselves to try to survive the night, but nearly all of them were dead. The paddlebox boat, which had dropped into the sea, eventually came ashore with some men alive and clinging to it. The next day, a small sailing schooner named Lioness reached the wreck site and found 40 or so men still alive, clinging to the ship's rigging, which still jutted high out of the water. They had survived the night and were taken aboard safely. Locals were alerted by a party of survivors who'd swum ashore. They managed to gather their strength and trudged 9 miles inland without shoes to raise the alarm. A whaleboat eventually plucked more survivors out of the water, some of whom had drifted for 38 hours. For days afterwards, boats patrolled the rocks and the shore to search for survivors, but it was clear the death toll had been immense. Of the 640 odd who'd been aboard, only about 190 were left alive to tell the tale. Captain Salmond had been spotted in the water, but it's thought a piece of wreckage came down on him and he was knocked unconscious and drowned. None of the senior officers, including Seaton, survived. They had been preoccupied to the last by keeping their men in order. The last request for the men to stay in place as Birkenhead broke up and sank had been just that, a request and not an order. The men had obliged and the boats had got away safely because of it. The news caused an absolute sensation, first in Britain and then the world. The fact that these men had stood so calmly in the face of certain death appealed to a certain sense of Victorian dutifulness. Less praised was the captain and crew of Birkenhead. Salmond had been running his ship extremely close to the shore, but he was not on watch when the ship had struck the reef. The initial depth sounding should have served as a warning that something dangerous was ahead, but the course was kept. Some of the crew were called before a trial, but any charges of negligence were dismissed because the captain and the senior officers had been lost. What the Birkenhead disaster did was cement the idea of women and children first in the public's mind. That was how men should behave in a disaster, it was decided. Any break from that kind of stoicism would be cowardice. The praise for the Birkenhead soldiers approached mania, and in the end, the practice of standing aside so women and children could escape even became known as the Birkenhead drill. These kinds of stories, and there are dozens and dozens just like them, aren't stuck in the public imagination like Titanic or Lusitania. They exist now kind of like footnotes in history, but it's amazing to think that once, not really too long ago at all, it was the kind of thing people regularly just faced trying to settle in a new life in a new country. The Oceanliner really changed all of that, especially as they got bigger and safer. You'll probably enjoy our video on the evolution of Oceanliner, which I'll link if you enjoyed this video. At last, it seemed like humans had triumphed. Except, of course, we were then cruelly reminded that actually nature is always boss. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.